Creationism has reached levels of desperation lately that I don't think I have ever seen before in all my years combating it as an idea. I've spent a lot of time here online debunking creationism of all stripes, from its young Earth variety to its old Earth variety to intelligent design proponents. And there are some creationists and even creationist organizations that I quite like. I like the people who are involved. I think they're kind. I think they are genuine in what they believe. I will always have a great amount of disdain for creationism, but I certainly don't have hatred for very many creationists. And yet something has been dropped into the water lately, because over the past 6 months, I have seen everything from what I think are just outright blatant lies to fairly pathetic arguments that I truly do believe my middle school grade cousins could debunk, and yet they're being made by actual adult people, to what can only be described as the most embarrassing thing I have ever seen from a creationist here online, and I have dealt with some real stinkers. Today, I want to talk about the desperation of recent creationism using 3 distinct case studies from the past 6 months, and I want to talk about how strange this all is in the grand scheme of things. Let's get started. Hello and welcome, my gentle and of course very modern apes. My name is Erica. This is my channel, Gutsick, and what we do here is I tell you guys about the latest discoveries surrounding and also generally adjacent to human evolution, and I also spend a whole lot of time debunking pseudoscience. It's actually been a while since I've talked about creationism on this channel. By my standards,
Bubby?
Yeah, baby.
I miss creationist debunks.
I don't.
But honestly, there's just been so much good regular science stuff to talk about lately, and I've also been spending a lot of time working on my dissertation and cordoning off portions of my pilot study for the abstract that I'm currently writing for the AABA's deadline, which is due in a few days. It's also looking like I'm gonna be graduating in spring and not in December like I wanted to, but you know, such is life. I'm not saying that it's you guys' fault, but you're not helping. I kid, of course. I'm very lucky that this is part of my job, although I will say the topic of today's video is acting as an occupational hazard. It's giving me stomach ulcers. Now, I know what longtime gutsickgibbon viewers are saying right now. First, they're celebrating. They're like, yes, finally, we're back to the creationism bonking. Excellent.
Hey, Queen. Girl, you have done it again. Constantly raising the bar for us all and doing it flawlessly. I'd say I'm surprised, but
And then they're saying, you fool, you simpleton, you giant goober. Why would you possibly be surprised at this point? You know that there are creationists out there who do lie and who do make bad arguments and who are embarrassing and cringe. And that's true, but what I think you're gonna see today, and you know, time will tell, you can tell me in the comments if I'm right or wrong about this, I think that I'm going to convince you that we're looking at a different, more virulent strain of those 3 things right now, historically, than we have been generally in the past decade or so. I think the lies are bolder, I think the arguments are more transparently bad, and I think the embarrassing stuff is enhanced. Why is all of this happening? Well, I have an idea, but since I'm trying to do, a good video essay here, you'll have to wait till the end for the conclusion when I wrap things up. So fair warning, I'm gonna be a little mean in this video. As I said at the beginning, there are creationists that I like, and of course, science-affirming Christians are always welcome here. I have absolutely not a bone to pick with those folks. But the people that we're talking about today are the types of creationists who do fall into that category of the creationists who I do have a great amount of disdain for.
Tough. That's what you get for doing stupid shit.
There's gonna be varying levels of meanness across these case studies, and I think obviously I'm going to be meaner to people who I think are outright lying and thus need to do some time in front of an academic honesty council than I am towards people who I think of more as the belligerent 12-year-old at my local park who I'm scolding, but they're not my kid. If they want to get themselves killed on the monkey bars, not my problem. So with all that in mind, let's start with Case Study 1, Big Old Lies by Casey Luskin. Oh my god, she's beating that dead horse again? Come on now, you know where you are. This room may as well be the Horse Pulverizer Incorporated. Casey Luskin is an intelligent design proponent and a geologist, so he accepts the ancient age of the Earth, but he thinks that some amount of creative intervention by the Abrahamic God is responsible for biodiversity we see today. Old Earth, yes. Evolution, no. And as a geologist, he is the perfect person to be keeping you up to date on all things genetics. You can tell whether it's safe or not to listen to someone speaking outside of their area of expertise by looking at what they say about an area that you know very well. If they're making basic mistakes in your field, then you know that you probably can't trust what they're saying in a field that isn't your own and also isn't theirs. If they're making elementary mistakes in one place, they're probably being just as careless elsewhere. Did you guys know that Casey Luskin, geologist, spends a lot of time talking about paleoanthropology, which just so happens to be my field? In this article, Casey Luskin tries to pretend that a recent study, proves that Homo habilis isn't actually the transitional hominin that paleoanthropologists have long hoped for, because this study found that Homo habilis filled a niche that was very similar to members of Australopithecus. Casey says we've previously discussed the fact that Homo habilis is morphologically more similar to the Australopithecines, probably belongs within genus Australopithecus rather than Homo, and does not have the right morphological traits to serve as such an intermediate or link. See, for example, here, 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 and here. Casey, who out there is proposing that Homo habilis looks more like Homo sapiens than it does Australopithecus, the hominin that directly and immediately precedes it? Why would anyone propose that? On this diagram of transitional crania from the first hominin to Homo sapiens, Homo habilis is cranium F. Why would anyone suggest that it should look more like Homo sapiens, which lives millions of years later, as opposed to the hominin that directly precedes it? In fact, evolutionarily, we require something like Homo habilis. The very last Australopiths should be the least Australopithy, and the very first members of genus Homo should be the least Homo-like. That's what a transitional species is. And in fact, Homo habilis has the scantest bit of characteristics that does align it with genus Homo as compared to Australopithecus. It has the dental characteristics. It has craniofacial characteristics. It has a handful of postcranial characteristics. Don't you think it's a little weird that the primary source that you're using in those other articles to say that paleoanthropologists think that Homo habilis should not be in genus Homo and instead should be in Australopithecus come from Collard and Wood from 1999, and they're proposing that on the basis of behavioral modernity, not morphology, as in not physical characteristics? Since Casey thinks himself familiar enough with paleoanthropology to write countless articles on it, surely he's also aware that by that definition, you're also going to boot Homo floresiensis, Homo naledi, and some members of Homo erectus from our genus, despite the fact that their tool using and craniofacially look more like us than members of Australopithecus. Casey doesn't know that because he's not familiar with the literature. If he were, you would find the citation of the most famous paper around to date on the Australopithecus to Homo transition, which is titled Australopithecus to Homo, the Transition That Wasn't, by Kimball and Vilmore. And this paper is about how the transition between Australopithecus to genus Homo is so smooth, is so well represented by the fossil record that you actually can't draw a clear line where Australopithecus ends and genus Homo begins. Just like, what we would expect from evolution. The abstract states this plainly near the end. This is the pattern inferred for species usually included in early Homo, including Homo erectus, which has often been cast in the role as the earliest human-like hominin. A fresh look at brain size, hand morphology, and the earliest technologies suggests that a number of key Homo attributes may already be present in the generalized species of Australopithecus, and that the adaptive distinctions in Homo are simply amplifications or extensions of ancient hominin and trends. The conclusion is even tastier. Beginning, however, the more we learn about early Homo, the less compelling is the case that an adaptive shift can be read from currently documented skull and skeletal anatomy as a major transition from generalized Australopith precursors. It concludes by saying, indeed, the expanded brain size, human-like wrist anatomy, dietary eclecticism, and potential tool-making capabilities of generalized Australopiths root the Homo lineage in ancient hominin adaptive trends, suggesting that the transition from Australopithecus to Homo may not have been that much of a transition at all.
Ooh, yeah,
It's clear why he doesn't cite that paper seemingly anywhere, and that's because it so robustly refutes his point that Homo habilis is considered by anyone to be a member of anything other than genus Homo, and also that there isn't this smooth transition from Australopithecus to Homo, because there is. I don't know what else you would call something like this. These are some of the crania that I pulled from the previous figure, now unlabeled, and here's how they're grouped by genus. This is how they're grouped by genus with a little more nuance appreciated. These aren't even the only specimens for the given species here, and yet you can hear Casey as recently as like a month ago saying,
So my question is, why doesn't the Smithsonian Institution basically disclose this information, that there are serious gaps in the hominid fossil record that do not show this nice gradual evolutionary pathway that is predicted by Darwin's theory, in which they claim exists.
"Oh, gaps, huh, Casey? Like where? Can you point to the gap for me? Is the gap in the room with us right now?" Now, those crania are not to precise scale, so I'll include here, just to cover my bases, a graph that I made in R using published brain case size data for the genera mentioned. Wow, would you look at that? Australopithecus overlaps with early Homo, and early Homo overlaps with Homo erectus. Wow, how inconvenient for Casey. How will he parse the hominins out now? I thought they were neatly separated and there was no gradient. I've spent the past 4 years as a doctoral student and then doctoral candidate in biological anthropology, the field of human evolution, and I can tell you that pretty much outside Wood and Collard, who wrote that 1999 paper, I have not met anybody who thinks that Homo habilis should be a member of genus Australopithecus because it just kicks the can down the road. Then you have to start including a lot of other clear members of genus Homo and Australopithecus by virtue of the same diagnostic characteristics that you're using to remove Homo habilis. I'm sure they exist, I've just not met them, which serves to say it's not the consensus in the field that Homo habilis shouldn't be a member of genus Homo. And also, Casey's entire point is kind of moot because Australopithecus also used tools. We know that they used tools at Dakika, and either them or Kenyanthropus used them at Lamequi. But Casey either doesn't know this, or he does know it and he's intentionally not talking about it. I will say, find it extremely bizarre that he could cite as many papers about the origin of genus Homo as he does in this article and in all the linked ones, and not have stumbled across one of the most famous papers, if not the most famous paper on the subject from 2016, Australopithecus to Homo, the transition that wasn't. It makes me think that he knows that it does exist, and he doesn't want to talk about it because it's extremely conclusive. That's just looking at Casey's take on one of his most recent articles, like within the past 2 or 3 weeks or so, concerning human evolution. If you go back further, you can find him bungling absolutely everything under the sun, as I talked about in my previous video on Casey Luskin and his major mistake that we're going to be rehashing here in a moment. While I say mistake, I think he was intentionally lying to his audience. That's my opinion, and I'll leave it up to you to decide what you think. Casey's big lie concerns genetics, and specifically, it concerns the genetic similarity between humans and our closest living relatives, chimpanzees. You've probably heard before that humans are 99% similar to chimpanzees. It's like 98.8%. Or maybe you've heard that we're 96% similar to chimpanzees. Both of those numbers are true. Both of those numbers are measuring different things, and we can pull in a third number that we've had since at the very least 2018 or thereabouts, that humans and chimpanzees are about 85 to 90% similar. You've probably also heard that humans are about 99.9% similar to one another. Well, that number is actually equivalent to the 98.8% similar that humans and chimps are to one another. If you use these other methods on humans compared to other humans, it drops by a similar scale. More on that in a moment, but suffice it to say, answering the question how genetically similar are two organisms is actually kind of tough because it depends on what method of comparison you're using. They're all valid but useful for different things, for different questions. And it also requires some context. You need another pair of organisms to sort of underscore whether or not the percent similarity by whatever method you're using is considered high or is considered low. Like, for instance, hypothetically, let's say humans and chimpanzees were only 85% similar to one another. You might look at that, and in comparison to the 99% that we get for a different method, you might say, well, that's actually not very much. That's a pretty steep drop. But then what if I were to tell you that by that method, rats and mice are only 70-ish% similar to one another? Humans and chimps, 85, rats and mice, 70. And likewise, what if by that same method, humans and other humans were like 87% similar? Well, all of a sudden, 85% doesn't seem very low, does it? But that's just hypothetical, right? Don't answer if you've seen the other videos on this subject. The reason why you see 99% typically as the percent similarity between humans and chimpanzees is because that's the percent similarity for our protein coding regions. Put extremely simplistically, that's the portion of the genome that we know does stuff. And in the portion of the genome that we are sure does stuff, and certainly does the majority of the stuff, humans and chimpanzees are about 99% similar. That's pretty similar, and I don't think you need a frame of reference to appreciate that. That's more similar than rats are to mice, or than lions are to tigers, or than African elephants are to Asian elephants, and it also is a bigger number than either a chimpanzee or a human has with a gorilla, meaning humans are more closely related to chimps than we are to gorillas, but chimps are also more closely related to humans than they are to gorillas, which never ceases to amaze me, and I think people should harp on that more. It's certainly a major issue for intelligent design proponents like Casey to have to explain under their intelligent design model. Anyways, here's the big lie. Recently, we got a new paper where the complete genomes for several different ape species, or hominoids, were published. This paper was gargantuan and a complete tour de force. It's an awesome paper. I did a video on it that seems to be doing quite well. People like it. People think that this subject is interesting. And what this paper did is it published the percent similarity in addition to a whole host of other stuff. The percent similarity was not the point, using several different methods for humans compared to a bunch of different other apes, and also for those other apes to each other. Now, part of the reason why this paper was so awesome is that the genomes were complete. So the human genome wasn't actually completed until the past 5 or so years. Same with the chimpanzee. They were mostly completed in 2000 to like 2005, but a lot of the highly repetitive areas of the genome, it took a lot longer to get those things squared away. And so now we finally have these complete genomes, or largely complete genomes, for all these different ape species. So we can compare them looking at protein coding regions, looking at the entire genomes with just insertions and deletions taken into account, or looking at the perfect one-to-one comparison, what is effectively the alignment number between two individual species. And so included in this paper was those numbers for humans and chimps. And as I said, for all the apes to each other. But the thing is, it's not like this is the first paper that's come out since 2005. We've been improving the human and chimpanzee genome across the years, across the past 2 decades since 2005. And so as a result, we've had really close estimates to the numbers that were presented in this newest paper since about 2018. We know that humans and chimpanzees are about 85 to 90% similar in one-to-one identical base pairs. We know that we're over 99% similar when looking at protein coding regions. This isn't new, but Casey didn't know that. Or maybe he did. I'll leave that to you to decide. After the publication of this new paper, Casey wrote over a dozen articles on it, hailing that at long last the myth of 99% similarity between humans and chimpanzees has been overturned. They are actually only about 85-86% similar to one another. Huge W for intelligent design proponents and creationists. Except no, not according to the authors at least, and I know because I asked them. Like I said, these percent similarity matrices were reported in the paper. But this was not news. That's why a lot of it was in the supplementary material. Why wasn't it news? Because, as I said earlier, we already had these number estimates. It can't be news if it's not new. That's why the majority of the paper was focused on all of the incredible minutiae that we discovered, that these authors discovered and reported on for other ape genomes, how they differ with regard to their centromeres or mini-centromeres, how they differ structurally within their own species and indeed between species, and so on and so forth. But Casey homed in on one thing, that percent similarity for essentially the raw alignment or for the gap divergence, pick your poison, between humans and chimps, a number that was significantly lower than 99% or even 96%, a number Casey thought that was groundbreaking. Why, Casey mused, is this number sort of squirreled away in the supplementary material? Why isn't this sort of the central conceit of the paper? After all, it used to be 99% and now it's only 85. That's a pretty big drop. Well, the answer, of course, is very simple. They've hidden it away because it's bad for the evolutionary paradigm, and big evolution can't have that. So they conspired with one another to stash it where no one would possibly look, in the supplement. But luckily, the valiant Dr. Casey Luskin has retrieved for us the relevant figure from the supplementary material, putting it front and center in his tell-all article to show us that the evolutionary emperor has no clothes. This is the figure that reveals the truth. Looking closely shows us how similar humans and chimps really are, as well as how similar humans are to all of these other so-called close relatives. That's an original screenshot from Casey's original article showing you the figure that he pulled from the paper's supplementary material, where that low percent similarity between humans and chimpanzees was sort of hidden away from public view, so it wouldn't be so obvious how wrong the scientists had been all this time. Not 99%, but a much lower 86%, as shown here in the figure that Casey has again pulled from the supplementary material of the paper. This is clearly the number that Casey Luskin thinks we should be using when someone asks how similar are humans and chimpanzees genetically. He says as much across these dozen articles. Yes, humans and chimps are only about 85 to 86% similar according to this figure, and indeed all of the percent similarities of humans to other apes seem pretty low. In fact, the human-chimp number seems to be the highest out of all of those represented. So if humans and chimps aren't actually related, well, then anything lower than the human-chimp number is also not related, according to Casey Luskin, and this figure that he has faithfully reproduced in his article. Wait, what's that purple thing at the bottom? Well, that's weird. It almost looks like the figure keeps going, but it's been cut off. Well, but that can't be the case, because the x-axis is like right there. If that were true, then that would mean that Casey would have had to have taken a screenshot of the entire figure and then deleted the data that continues downward and moved that x-axis label up. And he wouldn't do that, right? Uh-oh, it looks like he did do that. It looks like he cut a lot of the data out and reaffixed the x-axis. Well, okay, he might have just been doing that to save space, right? It's only really a lie if the data he's omitting were to, like, you know, completely atomize his point. And he wouldn't do that, right? He wouldn't cut out data that ran contra to the point that he's trying to make and reaffix the x-axis to make it look like that's the entire figure, because to me, and I'm just speaking for myself here, that would be a lie. Anyways, that is what happened. The data that he omitted were intra-specific variation, so the variation found within gorillas, within orangutans, within chimpanzees, within bonobos, and within humans. And for gorillas, the variation, or that gap divergence, was actually higher than the number that we saw for humans and chimps, meaning that two gorillas showed more difference by this method than humans showed from chimpanzees. Again, the specifics are in my other 2 videos on this subject, but if Casey wants to use this figure to say humans and chimps aren't actually related, then he's saying that gorillas aren't related to other gorillas.
No thanks. I choose my own destiny.
Biologically, we understand why this is the case. Gorillas have accumulated a ton of structural variation within their own species, which artificially, by the method that Casey prefers, leads to way more differences than actually exist if you look at the portions of their genome that are actually doing things. Humans and chimpanzees being only 85 to 86% similar to one another seems a lot less impressive when that same methodology reveals that gorillas and other gorillas are less similar than that. And the reason is because you would have to be an absolute bonehead to think that gorillas aren't related to other gorillas by common descent. So by virtue of percent similarity equaling relatedness, if gorillas are related to other gorillas by common descent, and the human chimp number is higher than that, then humans and chimps are related by common descent. And Casey couldn't have that. And so I think he cut that data out.
I went here and they said that you're the president. They said that no one ran against you because they didn't stand a chance.
So, friend of the channel, Dan of Creation Myths, is the one who broke this story, and he was alerted to it by one of his commenters. And when that happened, everybody from every corner of this little community, the sort of creation evolution community, apparently just lambasted Casey. I'm talking theistic evolutionists of every stripe on their blogs and on their YouTube channels were like, this is not good. This is not a good look. It kind of looks like he doctored this figure. At the very least, it's an egregious mistake and he needs to fix it. And of course, those of us who are less friendly towards intelligent design on the Peaceful Science Forum and over on the subreddit just absolutely annihilated him for this. Because if you have to lie to make a point, then you don't really have a point to make, actually. Casey had to understand the figure in order to present his case in this article. He had to understand the significance of this figure, what gap divergence is, what it's measuring. He outlined as much in that first article, which leads me to believe that he does actually understand the figure and the data behind it. That means that he understood the implications of the figure and of the parts that he cut out, meaning he knew what he was doing and the impression he was leaving his audience with when he cut them out. The fact that that data actually refutes the point he's trying to make means that he's lying by omitting it and stitching that x-axis onto the bottom of his new sort of altered figure to make it seem like that's the figure as the authors intended it to be. And I think that's dishonest. But it doesn't actually end there, because the authors also included other human reference genomes in that big comparative matrix. So would it surprise you to hear that humans are also less than 99.9% similar to other humans if you use that method that drops the human chimpanzee percent similarity from about 99% to about 85, 86%? Well, it does. By Casey's desired method of genetic similarity, humans drop to being about 87% similar to other humans, at least with the reference genomes used in this paper, although I will note that these numbers are generally recapitulated in other studies unrelated to this one. Does that mean that humans aren't related to other humans? Of course it doesn't mean that. It just means that non-functional differences in the genome accumulate way faster than functional differences do. And this makes sense because there's no selection to weed them out. Casey actually lies by omission in a later article by discussing the human-chimp similarity in the same matrix that includes the human-human similarity, but he only brings up the human-chimp number, despite the fact that the human-human number is like directly adjacent to it. Again, I think too highly of Casey intellectually to think that he just didn't see this or didn't understand it, which means he omitted it on purpose. So I think Casey is lying about the implications of this paper because he knows what the paper says and he's saying that it says something else. He seems to be telling his audience that humans and chimps used to be considered to be 99% similar, and now that we have the full genomes, it's actually only 85 85 to 86%. That is wrong because one, the 99% number is actually still reported in this new paper because the 99% number comes from a different method than the 85% number. The 99% is for protein coding regions. The 85, 86% number is essentially your alignment number plus your single nucleotide polymorphisms, etc. Number two, we've actually also had those numbers, the percent similarity by what is essentially raw alignment and the percent similarity in protein coding regions since at least 2018. And the reason for that is because we don't just have two versions of the human and chimpanzee genome. Scientists continue to work on stuff. So we've had more complete versions than the 2005 version of both of those genomes, like throughout the years, and we've gotten increasingly more accurate estimates for percent similarity by various means. So this number isn't even new. That's why it wasn't reported as news by the authors. And number three, even if these numbers were brand new and actually measuring what Casey thinks they're measuring, it wouldn't say anything about evolutionary theory or help intelligent design because by that method, humans and humans would be about 87% similar to one another and gorillas would be less than 86% similar to one another. That's why the same phylogeny or species-level family tree has been recapitulated by essentially every study concerning humans and other apes since we started sequencing genomes. And that phylogeny is the one that has humans and chimpanzees, plus bonobos, as being more closely related to one another than any of us is to gorillas, or to orangutans, or to hylobatids. Here's the thing though, you guys, none of that matters to Casey Luskin, which is why when he initially reported this either carelessly or by being intentionally deceptive, every creationist swallowed it hook, line, and sinker and started reporting it the way Casey has reported it. When Casey got busted for doctoring it, he threw up a hasty disclaimer on that first edited figure, changing it to the original figure, to actually including the entirety of the figure, and saying that he did it on purpose, but that it wasn't because the data were problematic for him. He just did it for, like normal reasons. I post here the full chart from You et al. 2025 because some people are falsely claiming that I originally omitted data from the chart because it somehow refuted my argument. This is false. The only reason I originally posted the human-ape genome comparisons, just the top 8 curves, was for simplification purposes, because that is the only portion of the chart that was relevant to my argument. The interspecific genetic differences, bottom 5 curves, are irrelevant to what I am arguing. My argument is not that human-ape genetic differences necessarily refute evolution, it's that evolutionists who for decades have claimed that humans are only 1% genetically different from apes were wrong. The top 8 curves demonstrate my point very clearly, and the bottom 5 curves are irrelevant to that point. There was and is no data in the chart that negatively affected my argument, and I always linked to the supplementary data where people could see the complete dataset if they wish. I am quite happy for people to see the full chart and that there is nothing to hide here. In fact, I already extensively addressed objections regarding interspecific genetic differences here before recent critics started making their false attacks.
Corruption is not bad. Corruption is only bad if I'm not involved.
Yes.
But if I'm part of that corruption, I'll defend it.
I'm sorry, but no, Dr. Luskin. Either you don't understand what this figure is saying and you don't understand the implications of it, or you are lying here because you do understand the implications. That the gorilla-gorilla similarity being lower than the human-chimp similarity by this particular method, looking at that gap divergence in particular, completely routes your argument that this quote-unquote lower percent similarity for humans and chimps, despite the fact that it had been reported many years earlier, you just evidently didn't know that, somehow creates a problem for evolution. That's why I think you're lying here, and why I think you deserve to get absolutely busted and bodied for it. This did not stop Casey Luskin from going on countless shows here on YouTube and crowing from the hilltops the same thing, that this is new, like this is problematic, that this is groundbreaking, and so on and so forth.
I mean, according to some you can compare the genomes of different species. I could make these numbers up, but okay, now that we're only 85% genetically similar to a chimp, do you think that they're abandoning common ancestry? Absolutely not.
And again, there's that heavy implication that it was stashed away in the supplementary material for some conspiratorial big evolution reason. I went over all the dozen-plus articles of his in a massive video going in depth on this entire subject and on his reckoning with it, but I wanted to take this moment to bring it up again because it can never get brought up enough times. I'm glad to see that I brought it up in addition to Dan of Creation Myths and in addition to Professor Dave, and again, it's appeared on every single blog post on the subject within this niche community, so I'm glad that people know what Casey has done here and know generally the truth of the matter. You can go to the videos where he's doing these interviews with like Sean McDowell or whatever, and the comment section is filled with people who are like, no, not quite. And they'll cite my video or Professor Dave's video or Creation Myths video or Joel's blog post or whatever. I've even spoken with creationists who I know who aren't buying what Casey Luskin is selling here. And to me, that is enormously encouraging that his attempt here at the conspiracy and throwing shade and misrepresenting and, in my opinion, lying has failed, and you need look no further than the view counts on all of his videos on this subject.
Let's go gambling! Aw, dang it. Aw, dang it. Aw, dang it. Aw, dang it.
This could have gone better. This is suboptimal. This is a rough start right here. If it was a speed run, this would be a reset.
People just aren't interested in this subject if Casey Luskin is talking about it, evidently, because people do think that this is a cool paper. They're interested in that. But Casey's opinion doesn't seem to be going over very well. It seems like people look at what he has to say, do the scantest bit of digging on it, and then come away with an understanding of the paper and an understanding of how he misrepresented it. Case in point, even amateur YouTube creationists known for using terrible arguments understand the nuance of this paper and why Casey Luskin misrepresented it. Here's Donnie Deals in a recent debate, initially trying to use the argument, getting called on the carpet, and then revealing that he actually does understand why it doesn't work.
You said 98%. There was a recent paper that came out where you look at the supplementary material, and it seems like when you consider everything, gaps, copy number variations, that we're looking at using a different methodology, it's actually closer to 85%.
I'm aware of those.
Okay.
When you apply the exact same metric in that alternative sequence comparison, what you find is that a human only matches the reference genome of another human in the databank by 93%.
Right.
So it's like, okay, if the number for us and chimp goes down, therefore we're not related, then we're not related to humans either.
Right. I think that's a very fair point. Yeah.
Also, even if it goes down between us and chimps, it still holds higher for us and chimps than it does for any other two organisms between the two of us, which is still consistent with evolution. But go on to the Y chromosome.
Okay, those are fair points. Firstly, the hierarchy stays the same. I agree with you, Eric. Chimps and humans are still going to be more similar to each other than they are to monkeys and fish and bacteria and so on and so forth. And very good observation you make. Also, when you bring in the gorillas, using that same methodology where you get the 85%, in the supplementary material, it looks like intraspecies gorilla differences are about 15% as well, 85%. And so it's not a key argument that I use because it does come down to, and I think critics such as Gutsick-Gibbon have made fair points on the issue that, okay, if we're going to go with the 85% number, well, now we have to admit that humans within themselves are 93% in some circumstances, and then gorillas within themselves are 85%.
With the Y chromosome thing.
Right. Okay. So with the Y chromosome.
That sucks. That's,
One might ask why he brought the argument up at all when he knew it was invalid, but I think we all know that he was just hoping his interlocutors didn't know that. Do you know where Casey Luskin's failure tastes the sweetest to me? In the creationist literature. So a new paper was released over at Answers in Genesis recently, a young earth creationist organization. And this article is looking at the genetic similarity between two members of E. coli, the same species of organism. As evident by the title, the purpose of this paper is to point out that genetic similarity should have no basis on how closely related organisms are in actuality from a creationist perspective. The genetic similarity may work for the evolutionists, but for creationists, it's just not going to work. It's quite poorly written, to be honest, but the author used to work with E. coli and so has kept up with genomic similarities between populations of E. coli whose genomes have been sequenced and compared, much like humans and chimps as well as other apes have been. The author singles out two specific populations of E. coli and points out that their sequenced genomes reveal that no matter which method you use, these two populations of members of the same species are less genetically similar than humans are to chimpanzees. In fact, according to this article, two members of E. coli can differ genome-wide by as much as half. It doesn't matter which method you're using for humans and chimps, this is substantially lower for members of the same species. The author concludes by proposing that genetic similarity can be used within reason, but does not define what within reason actually means. I think it's pretty clear that what they mean is genetic similarity can be used within kinds, but should not be utilized between kinds. But if genetic similarity can't denote a created kind, what can?
Nothing.
All the hubbub and misrepresentation of that You et al. Paper by Casey and those like him forced other creationists to take a closer look at other pairs of organisms which they would accept as related, which is something that I've been trying to get them to do for years and then finally did myself, and then most of them just ignored me on that anyways, although it did remove most of the Tompkins references from most creationist articles, which I was appreciative of that. But they finally took a look at that and realized that genetic similarity eviscerates creationism at every level. Remember, the same methods that we use to create species-level family trees, we use to create family trees within species. So if you've done Ancestry.com or 23andMe, the methods work the same. It's just at a larger scale with species. So if you accept that genetic similarity necessitates relatedness within humans, there is no reason biologically to suppose that that stops somewhere. But that can't be the case for creationists because humans and chimps are more similar by every method that you could possibly divine, evidently, than rats are to mice, or lions are to tigers, or African elephants are to Asian elephants, or evidently two different populations of the same microorganism. And so rather than accept that humans and chimps must be related, they just say that genetic similarity doesn't work as a means by which to determine relatedness. These guys would rather ditch Mendelian laws of inheritance and basic dogmas of biology than accept that they are apes related to other apes. But the fact that creationists have resorted to rejecting genetic similarity as reflective of relatedness, and I've seen this in other creationist media, not just this one paper, it doesn't seem like anyone is buying what Casey's selling, means that they understand the implications of this paper and of the genetic similarity between humans and chimps. Finally, they get it, that if humans and chimps are more closely related to one another than either is to a gorilla, or than rats are to mice, etc., then either creationism is nonsense or genetics doesn't work. And they went with the latter.
I kind of hate scientists.
Reflects the ever-creeping desperation that these people have to hold on to this particular ideology, in my opinion. And me personally, I noticed this shift only recently, which means if Casey hadn't outright lied about it and then been bodied 6 Ways to Tuesday by everybody with a cursory understanding of genetics, we probably wouldn't be here right now. So thank you, Casey. Good job.
You're learning so many important things, and I'm so proud of you.
Case Study 2, Last Thursdayism by Rob Stadler. This story surrounds Dr. Rob Stadler, who is a medical engineer. He got his PhD in medical engineering, and he is a young Earth creationist. But today he's going to be collaborating with Dr. James Tour, who is some kind of creationist. We're not actually sure. He's pretty notorious when it comes to fence sitting as to what he thinks about the age of the Earth. He's agnostic to it, I suppose.
One thing about me is that I'm actually completely self-aware. However, I am delusional by choice. You know what I mean? Like, my self-awareness really be humbling me most of the time. And so I gotta stay a little delulu to keep my sanity.
I've joked about this before, but, what do you call somebody who's agnostic about the shape of the Earth? You call them a flat earther. But I digress. This case study concerns one particular paper. It's a paper from 2016 titled Statistical Evidence for Common Ancestry, Application to Primates by Baum and colleagues. This paper is all about phylogenies, and specifically, it's about phylogenies in primates. So it complements the previous case study quite well. This paper is super special though, because it's one of those rare ones that takes creationist concepts and ideas seriously and tests them outright. It asks a super simple question. Given the data, the actual data that we have in biogeography, morphology, according to the fossil record, and genetics, what is more likely or expected? The phylogeny predicted by common ancestry or the phylogeny predicted by separate ancestry? So like I said earlier, phylogenies are species-level family trees, or sometimes population-level family trees, and they can be built in a wide variety of ways. You can build them using physical characteristics, or you can build them using genes. And what's super neat about them, and pretty critical for evolutionary theory, I think, is that whether you build the tree based off of genes or whether you build it based off of traits, by and large, those two trees are going to mirror and corroborate one another. So the family tree or the phylogeny that you build for rodents or for carnivores or for primates on the basis of their physical characteristics is going to be the same family tree that you get when you run comparative genomics on them, with some minor exceptions, but by and large, this is a great piece of support for common ancestry within, and if you take it back far enough, between all of these groups. It always bears repeating, but the logic and methods behind building these big, enormous species-level family trees is the exact same logic that builds family trees or phylogenies within species. This goes for dog breeds, and it goes for human populations, and it's the same concept that underpins like Ancestry.com or 23andMe, as I've said many times before. Creationists do not accept common ancestry. Instead, they believe in something called separate ancestry, which is what it sounds like. It's this idea that 6,000 years ago, if you're a young Earth creationist, or sometime in the misty annals of history, undescribed and unknown if you are an intelligent design advocate or an old Earth creationist, God created archetypal kinds of animals, the sort of forebearer of all of the subsequent members of their group. So God creates this archetypal cat and this archetypal dog, and from those archetypal progenitors, all modern members of that group descend. These are the created kinds of organisms mentioned in Genesis. There's a lot of legwork that they do to sort of connect the dots there, and a lot of that involves sort of penciling in their own dots. But the idea is that everything can be related within a kind, but kinds aren't actually related to one another, and any similarity that you might see physically or genetically, well, that's just the result of common design. Now, you might be thinking to yourself, well, where are these lines? Like, what actually are the created kinds? It depends on the creationist you're asking and when you're asking them that question, but typically they'll place it, especially for big-bodied animals like mammals, around the family level. So Felidae, or all the cats, that's one created kind. So tigers are actually related to house cats and lions and servals and things like that, but none of them are related to, say, dogs. Another kind might be the Canidae kind, or dog kind, where you have wolves and you have maned wolves and you have foxes and you have domestic dogs, and all of those guys are actually related, but none of them are related at all to, like, bears. The created kinds concept, or when you try to consider it scientifically, baraminology, attempts to appeal to people's intuition, because I think anybody can look at a dog and a cat and be like, yeah, those are two different things, and so it's easy easier for creationists to look at them and say, yeah, and they're not even actually like related at all. Anything that you see similarity-wise, like the fact that they both have hair or 4 legs or whatever, that's just common design. But the second you look at this even a little bit closely, you begin to notice that it's actually very stupid, much dumber than perhaps it seems at face value. For instance, if kinds are at the family level, this implies that lemurs aren't actually related at all to sportive lemurs, or that walruses aren't actually related at all to fur seals, or that pouched rats aren't actually related at all to regular rats. Now, that's obviously goofy in and of itself, like on its face already, but they also have a problem because another family of animals is Hominidae, and that's the great ape family that contains, you know, chimps and bonobos and gorillas and orangutans and humans. And that would mean that humans are great apes that are actually related to other such great apes by common ancestry and not by like common design. But I'm not kidding when I say the way that they get around that is they just go, no, the rules don't apply there. It's actually different for that because the Bible says so. Okay.
This video is for God, so if you're not God, keep scrolling. Okay. Are you f***ing me right now?
But generally speaking, this means if you are a conventional scientist or if you are a creationist of any variety, you will typically accept that the family tree that is created by morphology or by genetics is real within a family. But then if you're a creationist, you would say that the family trees that connect those family-level family trees, right? That's actually just an illusion. That's not real. Those aren't reflecting actual relatedness, but something else, common design, I guess. For creationists, there exists some divine barrier. Family trees simply break at some point. Now, the problem is that we have found no such genetic stop sign. Instead, as we would expect from evolutionary theory and common ancestry, trees simply merge indefinitely to a last universal common ancestor, forming a full nested hierarchy of all life. But facts these days are powerless in the face of nah. In 2016, though, scientists were still under the delusion that people could be convinced by robust experimentation working with enormous data sets. And so that's exactly what Baum and colleagues did. They tested whether or not the real data that we see now can be explained from a separate ancestry model, looking specifically at family-level separate ancestry. We overwhelmingly rejected both species and family separate ancestry with infinitesimal p-values. We compare these results with those from 2 companion papers, which also found tremendously strong support for common ancestry of all primates and discuss future directions and general philosophical issues that pertain to statistical testing of historical hypotheses such as common ancestry. And whoo boy, these p-values really do speak for themselves. This has not gone over well with them, so let me explain to you the drama, or at least the drama according to where I come in on all of this stuff. A couple of months ago, myself, Dr. Dan of Creation Myths, and Professor Dave from Professor Dave Explains covered a video that showed up on James Tour's channel, which was about evolution. And the reason we were interested is that James Tour normally only ever talks about abiogenesis and why he thinks that that's stinky and bad. It was weird to see him talk about evolution, and given that's the area that Dan and I know very well, we were like, let's talk about it. And in covering this video, where James Tour has on guest young Earth creationist Rob Stadler, we bring up the paper by Baum and colleagues, Statistical Evidence for Common Ancestry, Application to Primates, and we really gas it up. Even though this paper was mentioned essentially in passing, this became a real sticking point and led to this gargantuan back and forth between the creationists here and the conventional scientists. So timeline-wise, we have my own video, which is titled, I Think James Tour is a Young Earth Creationist. And after that, we get this unreal video from James Tour where the thumbnail and the title are just like directly in contrast to one another in the most gut-busting of ways. The title is a thoughtful challenge to Gutsick Gibbon's commentary on evolution and the origin of life. Cute, nice, this is something I would expect from somebody of James Tour's station. And then the thumbnail is the triggering of an evolutionist, and it's me like soying out like from the Gamergate days in front of like a flaming Hadean Earth. We came back and covered that again. My video was titled something to the tune of, I guess I'm beefing with Dr. James Tour, and these responses on our side were posted on Dan's channel as well, and Professor Dave posted it too, so it got a pretty large amount of attention, which is why I suspect James Tour continued to sort of hit the ball back over the net. As things got more specific, like homing in on interpretations of this paper in particular, it mostly became a conversation between myself and Dan versus Rob Stadler. Rob Stadler posting videos using James Tour's channel, and me and Dan musing either him by himself or the two of us on Dan's channel. I was sort of waiting to make this video. Now, to be transparent and perfectly frank, in the earlier portions of these exchanges, no one understood the minutia of this paper. Not me, not Rob Stadler. It was kind of a lot of us trying our best to understand based off of the published methods, but this was a paper that was from 2016, and there wasn't a lot of supplementary material to really get an idea of the details of this paper, so that actually required emailing the authors themselves, which was really funny because when I finally broke down and I was like, okay, I'm actually gonna have to get into the weeds on this because we were arguing about the minutia of the minutia, I emailed David Baum, and a couple of days later I get this email back from David Baum who was like, the creationists must have gotten a hold of this paper again, that must be why I'm getting emails from so many different people. And CC'd in the email was Rob Stadler. So it was like me and Rob had both separately emailed David Baum to try to get a better grasp of what the paper was saying.
This is exactly what I was afraid of.
But the really funny part is that David Baum didn't know that Rob Stadler was a young Earth creationist. So he's emailing myself and Rob and another person back as if we're all really good faith actors and conventional scientists. And so he sort of felt free to like do a little trash talking of creationism in the sense that he's like, yeah, no, these results are legitimate. Our methodology holds. It was appropriate. Here's why. Here's what they might say in return, and here's why that doesn't work. And that's hilarious, right? Because like Rob is in the email and Rob is trying to get Baum to say something that he can take and run with as a means to write that paper off. And Baum is not giving an inch. And because we're both in this email, Rob knows that I know that Baum is not giving an inch on this, which is just, I find it a bit delectable, if I may. And you can sort of spot that in my reply. I'm a little bit cheeky in addressing them both. But because of this, Rob and I end up having this pretty long back and forth over email. Just the two of us, and we're hashing out some of the issues that we have. Now, I'm not going to share any of his emails. I'm not going to violate his privacy, but I am going to summarize some portions of our conversation, and I do feel comfortable sharing my responses to him, at least for some points. So Dr. Stadler and I discussed a lot of different topics, but one of the big ones that I want to touch on here at the beginning has to do with whether correlation was assumed or not in Baum's methods. Now, I'm putting that in quotation marks because this is actually like a pretty big misrepresentation of what was done, but nobody really knew it at the time because Dan and I were still digging into the minutia at this point, and so Rob wanted to talk about how this paper didn't actually preclude the forest of life, this sort of separate ancestry model, because the paper assumed, in his opinion, that at the beginning there was no correlation between created kinds. The idea is that this artificially inflates that p-value, making it seem totally absurd because the authors are assuming that God wouldn't have used similar body plans, and those similar body plans are inappropriately skewing things in favor of common ancestry instead. The way that you would put this in sort of technical terminology is they assumed that there was no correlation at creation. That's what Rob wanted to point out. He's thinking God wouldn't have designed every group of organisms, every created kind from the ground up. He might reuse some elements, and so allowing for some correlation would be appropriate. If these guys didn't allow for correlation, then it's a straw man of the separate ancestry model. So he reached out to one of the other authors of the paper and essentially asked that. Two of the authors responded, and Rob was kind enough to share that correspondence with me. These authors were like, no, the origin states weren't correlated. Unfortunately, that doesn't mean what Rob goes on to think that it means. You'll see what I mean here in a moment. Dr. Stadler, though, takes this as confirmation that the Baum et al. Paper had created a straw man of the separate ancestry model because, in his opinion, God would have reused some elements. And so he takes this as sort of a gotcha towards me, meaning that this paper can't be used to sort of preclude separate ancestry, as I and many others have been saying it does. But that wasn't my point, and that's what I said to him. Phylogenies are population or species-level family trees. If you plotted the whole thing, you would have an enormous tree or bush of life where organisms converge back onto a last universal common ancestor. Smaller family trees can be isolated, though. We can look at the first dog and all its descendants, where and when the breeds like golden retrievers or Great Danes or Chihuahuas branch off. Or we could look at the first ape and all its descendants, where and when chimps and humans split, when that dyad split from gorillas, when that triad split from orangutans, etc. Variation in given species, then, may come from their evolutionary history. They may be unique to families, to genera, to species, or even to populations. But remember, creationists believe that some groups, these created kinds, which are united within their kinds, and from conventional science's standpoint, those kinds are also united to one another, creationists would believe that only the family trees within kinds are real. The ones that connect the kinds together, or the families together, those are just illusions that are, again, the result of common design. So humans and chimpanzees and gorillas, these guys are all separately created kinds according to creationists, and the only reason why they appear to form this family tree together is due to common design elements.
Okay.
All of us have 2 arms and 2 legs and 5 digits on each hand, and so on and so forth. A creationist would think they have all these physical similarities, so why wouldn't we expect them to be similar genetically? That doesn't mean they're actually related. That's just common design. Unfortunately for them, the phylogenies that are formed with common descent and the phylogenies that are formed with common design as distinct models, they're different. We know what to expect if either of them were indeed reflective of reality, so we can test them up against one another. If humans, chimps, and gorillas share a common ancestor, they will form a nested hierarchy. One pair will share more with one another than either does with the remaining species due to the nature of descent with modification. This is how family trees form, both within species and between species. Genetically, all 3 species will share the majority of their genome, after which humans and chimps will share more than either does with a gorilla due to changes accumulating before they split from one another, but after their dyad split with gorillas prior. They will have very few unique traits compared to the rest of their genomes. This creates the tree that we see. But if they were created separately, even if they were identical at the beginning, each lineage will begin to accumulate their own unique changes over time in their own respective directions. This creates a very different tree, where all 3 species are equally unrelated to one another. This is called polytomy phylogenetically. This is the difference in the pattern post-creation that I was referring to in my conversation with Rob and also in my videos on the subject. And this is what I thought was going on via Baum et al. This is where I thought those low p-values were coming from. And this is always where I thought the low p-values were coming from, whether creation started correlated or not. Now, it turns out, as you're going to see in a moment, Baum's methods were a little different, although the concept that I'm referring to here, that still holds, so I was certainly correct on that front. Good for me, I guess. The minutia takes us in a different direction. Boy, it sure would be cool, though, if someone performed maybe the exact test that I was just talking about with gorillas, chimps, and humans, though. Oh well. Rob continued to imply, though, in videos and in conversations via email, that this randomness versus correlation at the origin was some kind of gotcha. So eventually I had to just correct him on that. I said, you've got this odd characterization of me above, and I'll add in his videos, as someone who's caught being wrong and is now performing damage control. It makes me feel a little bit like you don't know what the point is, and I'm not sure if it's because phylogenetics isn't your background, or if it's because you'd like to hammer home being right on a random origin state as a part of the paper's assumptions. If it's the former, we can work through that. If it's the latter, I might pump the brakes if I were you, especially for any forthcoming response videos. I think I've been pretty clear on my perspective and how it's changed or not changed in my videos and in our correspondence. I have always, and still do, think this paper is lethal to any testable models of family-separate ancestry. I didn't know whether or not the starting states were random in my first or second video, but I suspected they weren't. I also expressed several times in the second video and here in this email chain that starting position does not matter for the impact of Baum's paper. The resulting comparisons between families are the point. That was again stated by Baum in the paper and to the two of us. Let me make an analogy for how I feel you've taken this. It's as if I'm reporting on a murder, and in discussing the evidence of the murder, DNA on the suspect's knife, their footprints at the scene, their credit card used nearby, I mention that the suspect drove a blue car when fleeing the scene. You present CCTV footage of someone who kind of looks like the suspect in a red car, and use that to argue that I was wrong about the suspect being the murderer. You think I've gotten something relevant but not critical wrong, and you're using that to dismiss the entire paper. This is, as you will see here soon, not appropriate for several reasons. Now, Rob Stadler is not the first person to use this common design is the reason why we have all of these nested hierarchies kind of argument, right? And I'm willing to grant that conceptually, it could be possible that an almighty deity designed everything on Earth, including the great ape family, just to look as if evolutionary processes were responsible when in actuality he was tinkering with them the entire way. That's technically possible. It's not scientific, but it is technically possible. However, there are versions of common design that we actually can test. Because remember, common design and common descent after the creation event are going to yield very different phylogenetic trees. So if we know how much of the genome or how many features were actually just the result of common design, we can take that into account and then we can compare these phylogenies. How much was the result of common design at the origin or at creation? 20%? 50%? 80%? Well, it won't surprise you to hear that creationists don't actually have any idea what is the result of common design and what features are the result of common descent within kinds. But we do know that what is from common design cannot be greater than 100%. This is also like the best case scenario for creationists, and especially for young Earth creationists, because if God starts with some of these kinds being virtually identical, then you don't have to account for the evolution coincidentally of all of these different characteristics. Those are the result of common design. That would be a cool experiment, right? You could start with a bunch of created kinds that are identical and then allow them to mutate and see how that phylogeny differs from like a known phylogeny. That actually sounds a lot like that experiment that I said I wish someone would do earlier. Well, good news, Dan already did that experiment.
This is exactly what I was afraid of.
He used humans, chimps, and gorillas as his test case and compared common ancestry to 100% common design at creation, followed by some time, comparing the results. Just like I explained earlier, the common design tree looked very different from the common descent tree, with special mutations independently accumulating in each lineage, making them look equally different from one another. This is not what we see looking at the real data. The real data looked like the common descent expectation, with humans and chimpanzees sharing more with one another than either does with a gorilla. Now that's just phenomenal. That directly and clearly explains the problem here for common design as a model. What did Rob have to say to this? Well, I'm not kidding, folks, but Rob's answer to this was designed mutability. He thinks that God was essentially actively tinkering along the way to give the illusion of evolutionary processes being responsible for biodiversity and for the pattern that we see today. Now, he didn't define his term, design mutability, specifically. He didn't give like a scientific definition of this is what it means. But we talked about this concept for a while, and I do think that I'm being fair when I say this is just a magic mechanism. This is directly analogous to some of this silly shit that we've seen as solutions to the heat problem for creationists. This is just like Donnie Deal's divine supercooling.
Although we may not know the source or the mechanism behind the supercooling, perhaps it is supernatural.
Or the late David McQueen's tubes.
Tube, which illustrates heat coming up from the BLOB, the blob.
It's basically something that hypothetically fixes the problem because it's completely made up to fix the problem. There is no data to support that anything like this exists. It only exists because creationists cannot accept the facts as they are.
What'd you just say? Huh. Wow. No, you're entitled to your opinion. That just sounds crazy to me. Crazy. Absolutely crazy. No, you're entitled to your opinion. It just sounds crazy to me. Look, I mean, just give me some evidence. Give me some evidence.
With designed mutability, Rob is essentially saying, you can't prove that God didn't do it this way. And it's like, well, no, I also can't prove that, like, to be glib, fairies didn't do it that way, or like leprechauns didn't do it that way, or like Bigfoot didn't do it that way. But there's no reason to suggest that any of those guys did do it that way, or that those guys exist as Rob conceives of them, and so we shouldn't consider them scientifically, because that's not how science works. Yes, that is a methodological, naturalistic perspective of science. The Christian founding fathers of Western science as we know it proposed that that's how we should do science, Rob. Put a pin in that concept, in designed mutability, and in my conversations with Rob about it. Now, eventually our email conversation sort of petered out, but our YouTube exchange, be it with myself and Dan, or with just Dan and Rob going back and forth with one another, and Dan and I sort of talking amongst ourselves behind the scenes, that continued to happen. On James Torr's channel, Rob was proudly crowing about how he was right all along and that this paper is just a straw man of the creationist separate ancestry model.
And this manuscript saying that there's strong statistical evidence in favor of common ancestry or the single tree of life. This paper also, when you read the methods carefully, there's this big assumption, it's a huge straw man assumption, that each family ancestor at its origin acquired character states at each character independently of all other family ancestors. So again, they're assuming no correlation structure at the beginning of life.
It's not, as we're going to see shortly. While he was doing that, Dan and I were continuing to dig through the methods and try to figure out exactly what was going on here. And eventually we shared our findings with Dan's audience in a live stream. The stream was appropriately titled, "This Paper Disproves Separate Ancestry," because it does, and for the reasons that we said it did, although the methods were a little bit different than we had originally thought. They were much more in depth. As previously mentioned, this paper tests whether the data that we see, what we physically have in various fields, is more likely or more expected under the common ancestry model, that's conventional science, or under the creationist separate ancestry model. The authors did this by using a permutation tail probability test, which uses a Monte Carlo approach to simulate data under the separate ancestry hypothesis, or hypotheses, considering they tested both species and family separate ancestry. And I should say specifically, it's Markov chain Monte Carlo. Not just Monte Carlo, but like specifically it's Markov chain Monte Carlo, or MCMC methods.
Hey yo, what the fuck?
Wait, please don't go. I'm gonna explain this. I promise it is not as bad as it sounds. Dan and I took 2.5 hours to go over just this concept, essentially in enormous depth, over on his channel. So if you want to understand the details, please go there. I'm going to explain what Baum et al. Did as simply as possible here. Phylogenetic trees can be long or they can be short. Shorter phylogenetic trees require fewer steps to go from the ancestral state to the modern or derived state. And shorter phylogenetic trees are more parsimonious or more optimal. More parsimonious trees are considered more likely to evolve than less parsimonious trees because there's fewer steps. It's just easier to evolve. Baum and colleagues took real data with the character states being randomly assigned, and then they created the most parsimonious tree on the basis of that new data. And they did that 1,000 times. When we plot this out with frequency on our y-axis and the length or parsimony of the tree on the x-axis, you can see the distribution of all of these trees. They're all pretty long because we're essentially trying to create the most parsimonious tree on the basis of random noise, but we should see a normal distribution. With that done, now we plot on that graph our real phylogenetic tree via common ancestry. This tree plots way to the left, far shorter and more parsimonious than any from our normal distribution of noise. This means that our real phylogenetic tree is far more parsimonious than what you can generate on the basis of what is effectively chance, even if you do it thousands of times. That implies that what we're looking at here is a real relationship, not an artificial one, not an illusion. That's already an enormous point in favor of common ancestry, because the whole tree is plotting far to the left as a real, genuine signal. But how do we compare that to separate ancestry, looking specifically at the family level? This works a little differently from the common ancestry model because the range of individual family-level family trees must be considered together. Remember, creationists accept that the relatedness within those families is real, it's just the joining of all of those families, those created kinds, that is artificial. So according to the family separate ancestry model, if the relationship between these families is not actually real, when we plot them against our noise distribution, they should fall within that distribution, not off far to the left. Because if they fall off far to the left, like our common ancestry model, that implies that the relationship between those families is real. And creationists need it not to be. Too bad it does plot off far to the left, just like the common ancestry model, implying that all of these families are in fact connected to one another in a way that far supersedes the odds by chance. This is actually pretty similar to what Dan did, in that our actual data are being pitted against two separate models, and they fall so far outside of what would be expected from a scientifically generated separate ancestry model that to even consider it would be absurd at this point. But in that video, Rob didn't understand how the paper actually works, which is what makes it so ironic when he accuses Dan and I of misleading people.
They are misleading all of us, and they have misunderstood the entire paper. And
okay, it looks like the caffeine might be hitting right now. What? What?
Now, hopefully you see that Rob was incorrect in his representation of that line and of the paper as a whole. The authors did not take a random starting state and effectively evolve the organism forward. And he admits this. He admits that he got this part wrong in his reply video to Dan and I's stream, or at least he kind of does. It's funny because he kind of accused me in those emails that I was talking about earlier of like being very tricky and dodgy and sort of cagey about owning an original position that I had, I guess because he thought that I'm incapable of admitting when I'm wrong, as if I don't do that all the time on this channel because I am wrong sometimes. But then he kind of does the same thing in this clip that Dan is about to show you from his video.
He's accurately describing the methodology and has, in so many words, acknowledged that his previous argument was wrong. He doesn't say that outright, but well, just take a look. You can just watch this.
so I'm going to start off, maybe this will surprise everyone, but I'm going to start off by actually making a concession here. When I speak of the forest of life, and you just saw all of this here, and I make the statement, no correlation structure at the start of life. Well, I know it turns out that in the paper by David Baum, which we just showed, the statistical ancestry paper, he did not literally derive the DNA at the start of life. So he didn't actually try to derive exactly what the DNA was in each of these kinds at the start of life. I get that.
Rob goes on to explain how the methodology actually works, and then he says this.
So if I want to be more accurate, this original statement that I made, and I've made it many times, I could have made it slightly more accurate, but much less understandable if I had changed these words here. Instead of no correlation structure at the start of life, I could have said, the designer provided no more correlation structure between families than chance alone would have provided. That's more accurate, but a lot less understandable. And so that's why I went with this one.
Well, no, that's not strictly speaking true, is it, Rob? You misconstrued the paper. You didn't know how the methods actually worked. That's the reason why you described it the way that you did, not for clarity. I don't know, it sucks to not be correct on something or to not be wholly correct on something, but in my stream with Dan, I mentioned multiple times, like point blank, what I was wrong about and how I was wrong about it. Again, The point still stood, but I should have been more careful on how I depicted my opinion of the paper and why I thought the paper worked the way that it did. I would just like to see the same from the creationists that I do tango with here. Now, Dan goes on to describe how Rob's newest video is better, but
that's about as good as you're ever going to get, so I'll take it. Thank you, Dr. Stadler. To be clear, this means that his previous argument was completely wrong. I want to be clear about that so everybody hears it. The entire argument was that Baum et al. Used a straw man argument for their separate ancestry because of the random ancestors. They weren't actually testing how a designer would have worked. The designer would have built in some pattern of similarity, and since Baum randomly generated each ancestral sequence, that was a straw man of the common design hypothesis, so it's not a valid test. He said this over and over and over. But Baum et al. Didn't randomly generate family ancestors, because they didn't generate family ancestors at all. And we're all on the same page with that now, which is great, because it's good to have an accurate understanding of the papers we're talking about, and it's even better to start with an inaccurate understanding and then revise your understanding to make it more accurate. Changing your mind to go from being wrong to not wrong is great, and that's what we're seeing here, right? Dr. Stadler was wrong about this test and how the actual method works, and now he's accurately presenting how these methods work, and that's great. And it also means that his previous argument is completely invalid because it was based on a misunderstanding of these methods. So now we're going to move on, because all of that we just talked about covers the less wrong part of the video, and now we're going to get into the still wrong part of the video.
yeah, after 2.5 hours, Rob still manages to misunderstand some things about the paper and about the methods, but that's fine. We'll talk about that here in a moment. First, I want you to hear from our live stream Dan telling what he thinks the two potential options for creationists will be going forward regarding this paper. Because make no mistake, this paper destroys separate ancestry. It really does. It disproves the only model of separate ancestry that currently exists scientifically, and it's like, this is not statistically viable at all, not even in the stratosphere of viable. So Dan explains the two potential ways that a creationist might try to worm their way out of sort of the impact of this paper. Let's listen to that first.
So here is my attempt to steelman Dr. Stadler as hard as I can. And Rob, if you see this, let me know if this is what you're actually going for.
The spoiler is Dan does nail Rob to the wall on this one.
So this is the most generous interpretation that I can come up with here, right? His critique is that the randomized data are not generating a realistic distribution for the separate ancestry hypothesis, because the actual process of creation of these separately created groups would either, we got two options here, right? Either A, it's going to result in a stronger artificial phylogenetic signal, i.e. shorter trees, right? The distribution was wrong because it didn't find trees that it should have found, right? That's one possible critique here. That distribution, for whatever reason, did not find the optimally short trees. Or he could say the process of creation would have involved hierarchically correlated family ancestors, meaning that the distribution that we actually got was artificially wide, because some of those trees in that distribution are going to be highly correlated in those family ancestors, and some of them are going to be quite different, right? At, since we're using families, I don't know what some families and primates would be, but some of those trees are going to have them just by chance very different from each other, and that's going to be a very non-parsimonious tree, right? So he could say we shouldn't be doing the statistical comparison between the whole distribution. We should only concern ourselves with the most optimal fraction of that distribution, right? That is a critique he could be making here.
Basically, both of these can be boiled down to separate ancestry isn't being given a statistical fair shake. What if the separate ancestry trees are actually better, more parsimonious than they're showing to be in this paper? Neither of those work.
Option A that I said, right? His critique is that the process of creation would have resulted in a stronger artificial signal than we actually get, right? That is begging the question, and I'm using that in the correct sense. He is assuming the conclusion he wants, saying that distribution is wrong. There are actually data points that are part of that distribution that you didn't find, right? And if that's the case, then I invite Rob to show that that's the case computationally. Pick up the baton, you have all the methods, generate your own distribution and show that the range, the minimum on that range that we just talked about should be a lot lower, right? Show that that's the case. You can do that. Publish that paper. That'd be awesome. Like, show us that that's the case. So what we're saying is, we've got our distribution, right? Whatever it is, we have our distribution of randomized data and real data, and they don't overlap. And either Rob is saying, well, this distribution should be wider, right? And if that's the case, rerun it, show us that the distribution is actually wider. Or he's saying, this is wrong. You have to only consider the good stuff. You can't consider this. You should only be doing your comparison between the optimal trees because that's how it would have been created, right? You can't consider this. This is not how a designer would work. You need to just use the best and compare it to your actual distribution, right? And for that second critique, the first critique, he's begging the question and run the simulation and show us that the distribution is wider. For the second critique, he can actually show that that's right. Because what you can do is actually, you can concatenate that data set, right? You can just cut it off at some point and rerun the analysis. But here's the thing, the data sets don't overlap with each other, right?
Yeah.
So you can do it where you can basically reverse the common ancestry test, where you're doing the real distribution for family separate ancestry and the single best tree right there, the single best one. And you could say, is this tree part of this distribution? You could basically flip the directionality of the comparison to make it the opposite of the common ancestry test I drew in purple earlier and say, there it is. Now, the numbers for that are not great for Rob because remember, the real range of lengths over here, the minimum is 11,000 something and the maximum is 12,000 something. And this minimum right here is 16,000 something.
Yeah.
But hey,
thousands off.
Run the test, see what the p-value is. Like, that is a thing Rob could do if his argument is the version that I just articulated. Run that test and show us. And again, like Erica said, ball's in your court. This is a published paper in the literature. It stands, on its own. If you got a problem with it, pick up the baton, do the analysis, and show that it's wrong.
I'm sure I don't need to tell you that Dr. Rob Stadler did not pick up the baton and run this test himself. Instead, he went with Dan's first option and implied that there's actually a much more parsimonious tree that is theoretically achievable by the separate ancestry model that Baum et al. Didn't manage to simulate or catch. That is just a fundamental misunderstanding of how the Monte Carlo method actually works. I really like the way that one of Dan's commenters put it. They said the Monte Carlo method is throwing a dice thousands of times to find out how many sides it has. Meaning Rob's suggestion that in actuality there is a maximally parsimonious tree that is so parsimonious it could be confused with the real phylogenetic tree. The odds of that happening and this test not catching it are essentially equivalent to rolling a 6-sided die 1,000 times and never rolling a 6. That is to say, extremely low. First, Rob tries to posit that this could be something that could happen from a mathematical standpoint, but Dan completely shuts that down in his video here. But it is in Dan's comments section that things really come to a head, because Rob doesn't release another video after that one. Instead, he and Dan proceed to have a very long conversation via the comments in which Dan is trying to find out what specifically, methodologically, does Rob take issue with in Baum et al. How could Baum et al. Have been improved to actually test separate ancestry to Dr. Rob Stadler's satisfaction? Let's take a look at that. In this video, Dan tries to explain to Dr. Stadler how these methods actually work. Since he went into the nitty-gritty of it, he tries to break this down for Rob, and Rob is just incapable of understanding it or just reluctant to, or he just won't whatever. Multiple people try to engage with him and it doesn't go over very well. And Dan goes over the comment chain in that video and it's very satisfying. But what I really want to focus on here is the crescendo to it all, where Dan says,
I said to Rob, I'm trying to convey that there are two things I can do, and I want to make sure I'm doing the correct thing to address your request, which I understand to be defend your claim that this paper disproves separate ancestry. I can justify the distribution itself, or I can justify the technique, but it's not worth it to do both. Jumping down, so I'm asking you to be clear. Is it in principle possible for this test to work? And then the highlighted part is the key thing here. So I'm asking you to please clearly say whether or not the comparison is in principle valid. The whole point of the PTP test, as applied, is that there is some threshold level of parsimony that is beyond the reach of separate ancestry / common design. Do you agree or disagree with that? This is the answer I need. Just an agree or disagree. If the answer is agree, we can talk about the distribution and how it should be constructed, right? Agree that the test works, but disagree about the specifics. If the answer is disagree, we can talk about the basis for the test in the first place, but I have to know which conversation we should be having in order to defend my claim. That's the whole point. I need to know exactly what the problem is so then I can make the argument. And I want to zoom in on this just so we have it on screen all by itself. The whole point of the PTP test as applied is that there is some threshold level of parsimony that is beyond the reach of separate ancestry / common design. Do you agree or disagree with that? This is the answer I need, just an agree or disagree. And Rob responded, disagree. And that, folks, is the end of this debate. That is it. That's the end. Because what is Dr. Stadler disagreeing with here? He is disagreeing with the position that there is some threshold level of parsimony that is beyond the reach of separate ancestry / common design. There is no level of parsimony that is unachievable via separate ancestry. In other words, it is a completely untestable, unfalsifiable claim.
To be abundantly clear, what Rob is saying here is that it doesn't matter what the data say. Nothing can ever be preclusionary to separate ancestry or young earth creationism because God could have done it that way. Everything is on the table.
That's what Rob Stadler has finally, at long last, admitted after literally weeks of back and forth and me asking over a dozen times, what are your falsification criteria? What observations are incompatible with your hypothesis? And in this final piece of the exchange right here, we have the answer. The answer is there are no observations that are incompatible with my hypothesis. Okay, that means it's not falsifiable. It's not testable. It's not science.
Ooh, that is the ball game for Dr. Rob Stadler here. And by association and by virtue of their collaboration, also James Tour, with regard to their variety of intelligent design or creationism. It is completely untestable. It is by virtue of its own conceptual basis, uninvestigatable by science. And thus, it is unscientific and need not be given the time of day within the halls of science. I'd like to note here that this is exactly what Rob implied to me initially, all the way back weeks, months before, and I expressed my frustration at his completely untestable idea back in that live stream with Dan, and I think it summarizes how I feel about it still, now that Rob has, I guess, publicly admitted that he has a magic model that can't be investigated at all by any tools of methodological naturalism.
The designed mutability one is genuinely bananas when you actually examine how it's supposed to work mechanistically, because you run right up to God is picking which mutations happen, is because it can't be probabilistic. You can't set It's not like dominoes where you set it up and then knock it over and it makes the pattern. Mutations don't work that way. If you're going to design it so a certain set of mutations happen, you have to actively guide those mutations to happen.
Not only that, but like, I hope that the extreme end point of this is clear to everyone. If design mutability is on the table, if created heterozygosity is on the table, if genetic entropy is on the table, again, 3 mechanisms that we have absolutely zero goose egg support for existing at all, then there is no way to tell where design stops and descent begins. Because Rob accepts, for example, that all dog breeds are related, and that dog breeds are related to wolves, and that wolves and all the dog breeds are related to foxes in Canada. He accepts that. That's why he's okay with family level separate ancestry, at least some of the families, right? So how do you tell the difference between descent within those families and design prior to those families? You can't. And because you can't, theoretically, you can take this to last Thursdayism, right? Theoretically, God could have done designed mutability all the way up to the individual level so that all of human relatedness to one another is just an illusion. Your relatedness to your mom and dad is just an illusion. You were created last Thursday as is, and every single baby that's been born since then, that's designed mutability. It's all just a ghost. There's no way to actually interpret anything of substance or any real history at all, because it's all on the table. God could have done it that way. And that's not science. And if you want to believe that, that's fine. But, you know, any phantom of credibility goes out the window in the scientific community the second that you're not just opening the door for a crack for miracles, which is, you know, already bad enough form, as many theistic evolutionists will tell you. Even old Earth creationists sometimes will tell you that kind of thing. But you're opening it up and saying that the miracle might be in the test tube. This is so funny to me because of how often Stadler's collaborator, James Tour, has talked about how strictly scientific he approaches questions like origins and evolution, when his guy here, the guy he brings on to talk about evolution, doesn't have a model and doesn't think that their model can be tested at all. That's where the upper echelons of creationism online are, with James Tour and with Rob Stadler, both pretty big on their sort of social media style of young earth creationism, going to colleges and trying to appeal to young people. That's where we're at with them. That's how desperate they've gotten, that when faced with a paper that tests to the best of anyone's ability insofar as it can be tested, the scientific version of separate ancestry as a model, and finds it to be so unbelievably lacking that it is laughable, their answer to that is to just say, well, God could have done it anyway. So actually you didn't test separate ancestry, you tested a straw man. But it's all straw men. It's just a field of scarecrows stretching infinitely to the horizon of the known universe. What I'm trying to say is that creationism is getting less and less scientific by the day, but when you've got the big guys like James Tour and Rob Stadler just admitting that their model cannot be tested and is not scientific, that tells me that they're getting a little bit more desperate than usual.
This is exactly what I was afraid of.
Aw, dang it.
Speaking of desperation, case study 3, Donnie Badinsky. The whole guy recently has been a case study. Donnie Badinsky runs the Standing for Truth YouTube channel and has been a funny adversary of this channel since around its creation. Donnie is a former used car salesman with no relevant credentials who likes to make videos on the Standing for Truth YouTube channel about how supremely evolutionary theory, yes, the foundation of modern biology, and the ancient age of the Earth, yes, the idea that created geology in its modern sense, is defeated by the awesome science of young Earth creationism.
Excuse me, where did you get the data for these slides? I made it up, okay? All of this data is made up. I have an incredible imagination and a rich inner life.
The funny thing is, if that sounds kind of dumb and silly, that is also the same thing that our previous entry Dr. Rob Stadler believes, so let's not pretend like Donnie is exceptionally goofy in his belief system. Now, I may be in the minority here, but I truly do believe that Donnie does understand some of what he is attempting to teach over there. We saw him demonstrate as much in that debate earlier about the human-chimpanzee genomic similarity.
And so it's not a key argument that I use, because it does come down to, and I think critics such as gutsickgibbon have made fair points on the issue that, okay, if we're going to go with the 85% number, well, now we have to admit that humans within themselves are 93% in some circumstances, and then gorillas within themselves are 85%.
What the Y chromosome thing?
Right. Okay. So with the Y chromosome,
the elephant in the room on that one is that he did still try to misrepresent that concept in that debate that we saw earlier, but I believe that that's just that used car salesman DNA within him. It's his nature. He can't help it. So sometimes he gets it, and other times I think he is talking about concepts that he does not actually have a basic understanding of, as I think we'll see later. But I say all that because by and large, most of what he's doing on his channel is attempting to popularize the arguments that the professional creationists make. And together with his partner / minion / maybe thrall, Matt Naylor, they run the Standing for Truth YouTube channel as well as its sister website / blog. There's really two things that Matt is known for, at least in the circles that I run in. The first is that he is a former breatharian, so these are guys that believe that you can get all the nutrients you need from breathing. Brother is filter feeding through the air, I guess. I don't know. And then the second thing he's perhaps best known for is faking a publication. Here's a screen grab of it in all its glory. He just kind of photoshopped that plus biology logo there at the top. I know it's hard to tell what with the Wikipedia screenshot there right underneath the abstract and all, but this actually isn't a real plus biology publication titled Antediluvian Patriarch De Novo Mutation Rate by the prolific author known as Raw Matt. I don't know why he did this. I don't know who he thought he would fool. But this is coming from the same mind that created this infamous Punnett Square. Jump scare, make a sanity saving throw. He actually put this in a real paperback book that you can purchase off of Amazon right now. It's called The Young Earth Creation Model. Here's Dan's copy.
Uh-oh. Looks like this person has been infected with shit idiot brain fungus.
A lot of my YouTube friends have covered content made by Matt before, and so I asked them before I made this video, like, give me some of your greatest hits from Matt Naylor, and they did. Dapper reminded me that Matt thought the Bible was written in pre-Yiddish, didn't know the difference between Orthodox Judaism and Eastern Orthodox Christianity, and of course thought Morganukodon didn't have molars while showing a picture of the molars. Jackson reminded me that Matt thought a gene got translocated to the plasma membrane one time, and Jordan reminded me that Matt thought that the Earth could work like a centrifuge, pulling old uranium deeper into the crust of the Earth and artificially creating old nuclear dates. So, I think the nicest way to put what I know we are all thinking is that Matt Naylor does not know very much about any scientific topic.
I was rude, but I was rude to an idiot.
Perfect guy to be helping Donnie at the helm here with overturning basic conventional concepts in science, I know. He was actually Donnie's partner in that debate that I showed you earlier. Now, Donnie is something of a complicated guy for me because he's nice enough, he moderates debates pretty well, and he has a golden retriever. I think what I like the most about him is that I've really punched down at his channel a lot over the years, and he's really good at taking it in stride. He's really not worth engaging with most of the time, and that's in part because his channel is like a fire hose of misinformation, and a lot of it is stuff that I've already covered before, and I just refuse to make 10 videos a week saying the same thing over and over and over and over again. But every now and again I get off my high horse and I find some utility and fun in engaging with something that he said, or a video that he's created, or an argument that he's made. And it's actually a lot easier on my conscience to do that these days now that he no longer hosts convicted criminal Kent Hovind, much to the detriment of his creationism content over on the Standing for Truth channel. So if Donnie is just like this random Canadian apologist, good for demonstrating a concept or occasionally finding a funny, good-natured creationist to dissect, why are we talking about him today? Well, originally I was going to highlight that Donnie is saying that he solved the heat problem. again. And so this is going to be a fun romp into why he's saying that, bookended by all of the previous times that he has said that. But then he went and did the most embarrassing thing that anyone in a science or science-adjacent space can do. He started posting AI-written articles, but passing them off as if they were his own work.
That's very interesting. We're going to have to come over to your house and kill you. No two ways about it.
I'm talking about community posts on YouTube and full-on write-ups in his blog titled Truth in Research, complete with M-dashes and the fucking emojis ChatGPT uses. I've never used AI in my writing, and I never will. It is a great fear of mine that someone will accuse me of using AI due to the poor quality of something I have written. I never want something that I have written to be confused for something that ChatGPT could write. And the reason for that is because ChatGPT makes frequent mistakes. It hallucinates and it wants to make you happy. And so it can frequently just whiff basic concepts. And I know because I have tried to use it once before when the deep research tool first came out. I tried to use it to find a specific source that I was looking for, and it made one up. That is the first and only time I have used it in my research process. For me personally, I see it as more of a potential pitfall when it comes to writing videos. That's not to say that there isn't a use for AI. AI can be a wonderful tool, and I do find a lot of utility in it when it comes to checking code that I'm writing for R, because I'm not a coder. I'm really, really bad at it, and so frequently I'm missing brackets or commas or whatever, and LLMs can help you troubleshoot why your code isn't working from a very mechanistic point of view, and then you can also learn how to not make that mistake in the future. There are things that it's really good at, and if you run them locally on your machine, it has less of an enormous resource gobbling, environmentally destructive impact. AI or LLMs or whatever you want to call them, they can be useful as tools, but they should never be used as crutches. It simply has no place, in my opinion, anywhere near art or writing or music, and you will never find me intentionally using any AI on this channel. I only say intentionally because I have been fooled before by clips on Instagram or on TikTok. I'm doing my best, but these are getting really good. With all of that said, how is Donnie utilizing AI to further the goal of young Earth creationism? Well, folks, it's actually pretty simple, mostly just by having ChatGPT write his articles for him and also using AI to generate images of his enemies. Other creators are already going in depth into these articles. Joel Duff's already done it, and Dan of Creation Myths has already done it. So what I'm mostly going to do here is make fun of how they're structured. Here, Donnie has created an article or a community post. This is also an article posted on his blog titled "Another New Study is Released," with our little alarm emojis there. What do Pokemon and the fossil record have in common? Another emoji. And then he starts to explain it. As a biblical creationist who has also been a lifelong Pokemon fan, I've been exploring these ideas for quite some time. And now, I'm extremely thrilled to finally be sharing a preliminary study. Oh, a study. Interesting, that I believe could be a real game changer. We got emojis down here, video game, and then an Earth, and then a T-Rex, and then it's classic ChatGPT fare, guys. He even generated a nice little image to go with it, where we have Charizard next to a trilobite, and it's titled From Kanto to the Cambrian. Now, first things first, this isn't a study, right? This is not taking data and actually evaluating it systematically in any new way. And of course, the data themselves are also not new. Second of all, this is just ecological zonation. Here we have our lightning bolts. This is more than just ecological zonation. No, it's not. You are making an ecological zonation model and just trying to refresh it by drawing analogy to Pokemon. So all of the same issues with the ecological zonation model by creationists just still do apply here. For those of you who may not know, the ecological zonation model is an attempt by creationists, usually young earthers, to explain the order of the fossil record. The fossil record is ordered according to evolutionary theory, which doesn't make any sense if the global flood of Noah is supposed to be responsible for all of it. So the idea that the ecological zonation model puts forward is that we're not seeing various communities separated by immense amounts of time as evolution changes populations of organisms, but instead we're looking at communities in space. The idea is that you don't find dinosaurs mixed in with humans, or you don't find a rabbit in the Cambrian because rabbits were living in a different place from Cambrian fauna, or mammals were living in different ecosystems on different parts of the continents as compared to dinosaurs. They're not separated by time, but by mere space. That's dumb, and the reason is very simple. They aren't separated by space. In single sections of the geologic column, you can pass through multiple periods and watch as the succession of animal groups occurs before your very eyes. But this argument is also just destroyed fairly easily on an intuitive basis, which is rare in biology, because marine predators that are found all across the world in the fossil record and today aren't found mixed together. They don't have different habitats. Their habitat is the whole ocean, and we don't find blue whales mixed with basilosaurs, mixed with mosasaurs, mixed with Dunkleosteus. They can be found with other time-appropriate species that occupy similar or adjacent niches, but never something that lived millions of years before or millions of years after. And that's because they're not separated by habitat or space as proposed by ecological zonation, but by actual millions of years of time. So this does not work, but also this article sucks because it was written by AI. Donnie's community page is just filled with trash like this. Absolute garbage. To be clear, before he started using AI, these posts were still wrong, but they weren't like slop. They weren't AI slop like this. He had the decency to handcraft his pseudoscience. In this article you can see on your page now, I guess I should call it a post because it's not an article. He says, new article drop. Dr. Dan Sturden-Cardinal has tapped out. And this is meant to be a response to Dan because Dan pointed out that Donnie was making these AI articles and he was going through why they were factually incorrect. So this is Donnie's attempt to respond to that. And it's abundantly clear going through this that, again, he just took Dan's response, like probably like a transcript of it, fed it into ChatGPT, and was like, please debunk this, AI daddy, do something for me. Again, it's complete with the emojis, and to make matters even stupider and more cringe, at the very bottom, we have not one, but several AI-generated images of Dan, or, I don't know, what was that, a cop? A cop that says the spell check police. Why did you waste resources generating this, Donnie? This probably destroyed like a 10 by 10 patch of forest just to make this hideous cop image when you could have just made it yourself. You could have just Googled police officer and stuck that into Microsoft Paint. You used to do that. Back in the day when Donnie would argue with the critics, he would actually take the time to get a screen grab, pull them out of the screen grab and then Photoshop them into situations, or Photoshop like egg on their face, or Photoshop himself wrestling them and defeating them in the arena. Please, Donnie, go back to photoshopping yourself and Dan into borderline homoerotic sweaty wrestling scenarios instead of having ChatGPT generate this image of Dan plugging his ears and crying, but his fingers aren't even in his ears, Donnie. What's going on with this? Didn't catch that, huh? ChatGPT, not as good as a person. You could do better than this.
Everyone's better than this because this is the worst thing I have ever seen.
Now, I think the goofiest of these AI articles has got to be the one where Donnie tries to make sense of Neanderthals. Neanderthals are a hominin species that is a sister group to humans. They were like us in a lot of ways, and then they were also very different from us in a lot of ways. They definitively do not descend from humans, but we do share a common ancestor, and that common ancestor lived a very long time ago. So it's very difficult for creationists to actually square how Neanderthals fit in with young Earth creationism because they don't. And I made an entire video about it. This article is kind of a response to that, but more it's a response to the arguments made within that video, which were first put forward here on YouTube by Dan Stern-Cardinal and also Just a Walking Fish. Here's a clip from that video that explains how they sort of conceive of Neanderthals. Neanderthals just descend from humans and are also just humans themselves, albeit very degraded ones. Specifically, so the degradation model goes, they are a population that that split off from Babel, was one of the first ones to head north into the harsh environment of Europe, where they were simultaneously hypermutating and also inbreeding excessively, which explains why they look like that. A little bit, apish, and why their genomes are so different. This doesn't work for reasons I explained in that video. Before I show you that, in that video, I outlined two distinct creationist models, or way of understanding Neanderthals, and I dubbed them the truncation model and the degradation model. They're different in some pretty important ways, but Donnie just kind of mashes the parts of each that he likes together, even though they are distinct from one another and make very different predictions. The details don't really matter, and you can watch that video if you like to understand the nuance of each position, so that you can then read Donnie's article and understand how he just doesn't care about the nuance of either position and just, like I said, mashes them together how he pleases. But the main point that Donnie is trying to make, that I already busted up in that video, is that you actually can't have a population of organisms that is simultaneously hypermutating and also inbreeding. Whether we're looking at mitochondrial, Y chromosomal, or nuclear genetic material, every single time Neanderthals are not nesting within Homo sapiens, they do not descend from them definitively. These degradation model young Earth creationists have tried to weasel their way out of what the data says by saying, well, it may be that Neanderthals are incredibly distinct genomically, but that's just because they're hypermutating and also inbreeding. And I know what you're thinking if you've been paying attention this whole time. Even if they were hypermutating, that wouldn't solve the problem of them not nesting within Homo sapiens. It would just make the phylogeny look a little different. To steal another one of Dan's figures, the Neanderthals would still nest within Homo sapiens, they would just have a lot longer branches. And I'm sure you've no doubt caught the other problem with this idea of post-Babel hypermutating and also hyper-inbreeding Neanderthals, and that's that you can't be hypermutating and also inbreeding. They are definitionally opposites. Within our mechanisms of evolution here, to harken back to Biology 101, mutation is one of the mechanisms, and it's known for increasing genetic diversity. On the other hand, the founder effect, a type of genetic drift, and another word for inbreeding, is known for definitively decreasing genetic diversity. So you can't have a population that is simultaneously hypermutating, increasing its diversity, and also inbreeding, decreasing its diversity. Now, the reason I made you watch that is because in Donnie's article, which we're not going to go over because I kid you not, it just makes the same argument that we've already heard a zillion times. Here it is in all its glory, truth in research. And it has to be an actual study to be considered research, I think, but I digress. If you scroll down to the bottom, he has this section titled Anticipating Criticisms. And in this section, Anticipating Criticism, he has a bit on phylogenetic tree placement. Skeptics may argue that Neanderthals cluster separately in DNA trees because they diverged long ago from modern humans, yet phylogenetic trees primarily measure mutational distance, not absolute ancestry. Groups exposed to accelerated mutation rates can appear deeply divergent even if they share the same recent origin. No, they can't. That's what I'm trying to say. That's what I said in that video like a year ago, and you still have not addressed that. The pattern is the point, and you can't actually get that pattern by hypermutating plus inbreeding. Again, those are like distinctly different things that are kind of in opposition to one another, but even if they weren't, you wouldn't get that pattern. If they were hypermutating, you wouldn't get it. If they were inbreeding, you wouldn't get it. The problem is how they cluster. Address that, please. Now, to be fair, that's nothing new with Donnie, right? That's where the Donnie deals fallacy comes from, which is like a funny name I coined for whenever pseudoscientists do this one particular tactic, if you can even call it that. The way the Donnie deals fallacy works, Donnie deals being the name that Donnie took when he was a used car salesman, is that a creationist might say, young Earth creationism is true because of A. And then you say, no, actually that doesn't work, and provide criticism B. And then they say, but have you considered A? It's just reasserting the original point without actually addressing the criticism. That's what Donnie just did in that article with regard to the pattern of phylogeny that we see with Neanderthals. That is not why this AI article is funny. No, this AI article is funny because of the reason Donnie proposes for this hypermutation. He thinks hypermutation solves the problem. It doesn't. But the reason why that hypermutation is happening can be found inside this little figure here. This figure proposes that the flood, the global flood of Noah, provides global volcanism, tectonics, heat, and radiation release. That's your accelerated nuclear decay. That's what's causing the heat problem. Young Earth creationists believe that most or all of the geologic column was formed during the global flood from Noah's Ark approximately 4,400 years ago, and that virtually all of that geologic column was laid down just within the 1 year of the Noah's Ark story. Now, this is obviously a problem because that geologic column is quite large. It contains anywhere from 4.5 billion to 550 million years worth of time and worth of processes. So all of the impact events and the movement of the continents on the crust and just run-of-the-mill geologic forces that we know occur very slowly, all of that has to be basically put on fast forward because creationists suspect that it all happened during that single year-long event. But it's not just regular run-of-the-mill geologic processes that are found within the geologic column. As you're probably all aware, we can radiometrically date rocks and get an absolute age by looking at the ratio of isotopes within these rocks. And it is from this process, radioactive decay, that we get most of the heat problem, which I believe precludes young Earth creationism entirely. Here's a clip from one of my videos explaining it, and then we'll come back to this Neanderthal thing. All radiometric dating is an appeal to very basic laws in physics, more specifically the radioactive decay law. It works a little something like this. You take a sample of rock, and in that rock you are going to have elements and specifically radioactive isotopes. Some of these isotopes are extremely stable and some of them are not stable at all. And unstable radioactive isotopes will spontaneously decay into a more stable daughter product at a known rate. The amount of time that it takes for half of the amount of that parent material to decay into its daughter product is its known half-life. And we know half-lives are consistent and constant because we have tested this over and over and over again in the lab and using observation in natural environments. So let's say we have a rock formed with uranium-238 in it. Uranium-238 is unstable and will decay into lead-206 after 4.5 billion years. If you were present at the formation of this rock example, and then you waited 4.5 billion years and came back, it would be half uranium-238 and half lead-206. If you would come back another 4.5 billion years later, half of that remaining uranium-238 will have decayed into lead-206, and so on and so forth. So what we can do then is look at any rock and look at the ratio of parent to daughter radioactive isotopes of known decay chains, and then take that back in time to see when the rock actually formed. This is called absolute dating, and it is extremely useful to us in the modern era because we use it to find fossil fuels in a process called basin modeling. Now, you might be thinking, okay, well, that's great that we know how old the Earth is, but like, what does this have to do with the heat problem? Everything. Because when radioisotopes decay, they release heat. Not that much, but they release a little bit of heat every time this decay actually occurs, regardless of the series that we're looking at. Every year, we can actually measure the amount of heat that is put off, like due to this decay, like across the Earth or in isolation in labs for specific elements, specific decay chains, what have you. That's not a problem for conventional science because it's only a little bit every year. But what happens if you take 4.5 billion years worth of decay, or just 500 million years worth of decay, like the heat from that decay, and cram it into a single year? You get the vaporization of the granitic crust of the Earth several dozen times over, something that I hope I don't need to tell you a wooden boat would not survive. To put this into actual numbers, joules if you will, this is 1.86 times 10 raised 29 joules for 500 million years worth of decay. This is the equivalent of setting off 44 hydrogen bombs in every cubic kilometer of the planet. And if we up it to 4.5 billion years, it's 1.68 times 10 raised 30 joules. 402 hydrogen bombs for every cubic kilometer. For the record, to boil the oceans, you need 5.6 times 10 raised 26 joules of energy, and to vaporize it completely, you need 3.7 times 10 raised 27 joules. So that's just the nuclear decay. You can add things like the lithification of limestone, the hardening of all of the magma that we have to explain in the geologic column, all of the impact events, and the friction of the continents as they go from Pangaea to the current positioning, or Rodinia to separating out and then Pangaea to current positioning. Like, none of this works. It's an obscene amount of heat. What's interesting is that a lot of those numbers come from young Earth creationists who are basically saying, we have a problem. And kudos to them for admitting it, right? Answers in Genesis has an entire thermal problems with the Genesis flood series where they go through each of these major sources of heat and are like, we're working on it. We're trying to make it work. Some back of the envelope math for the most popular young Earth creationist flood model, which is CPT, or catastrophic plate tectonics. This amount of heat release, adding all of that stuff together just for the past 500 million years. So we're allowing God to create most of the geologic column to look old, or to accelerate nuclear decay during the creation week. We're only concerned with the geologic column that contains life. The amount of heat released for all of the processes within the past 500 million years is equivalent to every cubic kilometer of the Earth getting its own 48 hydrogen bombs setting off inside it. The vast majority of that heat is due to accelerating that nuclear decay, which is what makes what Donnie says in this article so funny to me. Because how do we get all that hypermutation? Well, during the flood, global volcanism, tectonics, heat, and radiation release causes the immediate post-flood world to have unstable crust, radiation-rich rocks, and caves with chemical deposits. And Neanderthals, which are small human groups, are migrating into those regions and living inside those caves. Mutation accumulation in the immediate post-flood world, which is the same as the immediate post-flood world, this is the problem with using AI to generate your figures. Exposure to radioactive caves that they're living in, environmental exposure, that's what's causing hypermutation, all that accelerated nuclear decay. I don't think they need to be worried about hypermutations if every cubic kilometer of the Earth is getting its own 48 hydrogen bombs detonating within it, you guys.
That sucks. I mean,
I hate to say it, but this is idiotic. This is weapons grade silly right here. This is some Marvel-ass world building. It doesn't make any sense, first of all. It lacks a mechanism. It doesn't even work within the context of the Neanderthal stuff, even if you allowed for it to occur in the first place. But you kind of have to solve that heat problem before you start proposing that there's actually a feature to all of that accelerated nuclear decay. This doesn't work. Like, setting all of that aside, there's just so much wrong with this. Setting all of that aside, right? The fact that the hypermutating wouldn't help, the fact that the accelerated nuclear decay is already vaporizing the granitic crust of the planet several dozen times over, putting that over here. Where are the caves, Donnie? This is accelerated nuclear decay to some degree within caves. That leaves a mark. We have caves that we know for a fact Neanderthals lived in. We have caves that they're buried next to. Where's the radiation? But this is what happens when you let AI brainstorm for you or write articles for you. You get shit that just doesn't make any sense, that doesn't work, that's a complete hallucination. Either that or this is raw Matt's idea. Come to think of it, I would ask why they haven't asked ChatGPT to solve the heat problem for them. I'd wager they probably tried, and even ChatGPT is not dumb enough to propose that there is a solution for this. But they don't need to ask because they've actually solved the heat problem again, you guys. Good news. Now, I know what you're thinking. How could a used car salesman online and his cultish buddy have solved the heat problem when all of the major young Earth creationist organizations openly admit that this is not a problem that is solved, and in fact, it may not be solvable? Let's dig into this for a minute here, briefly at the end. I want you to appreciate how desperate this part of Donnie Deals' current trajectory actually is. There are two young Earth creationist flood models that attempt to explain what happened during the global flood to yield all of the modern signals that we see today in the geologic column. The first one, which is far more popular, overwhelmingly, this is the model that most young Earth creationists, professional and amateur alike, hold to, is called catastrophic plate tectonics. Here's a clip from my other video explaining. CPT goes a little something like this. Before the flood, the Earth was a single supercontinent. Answers in Genesis would propose Rodinia. Then, during the flood, plate tectonics occurred, but catastrophically, or on fast forward. Slabs of oceanic crust broke loose and subducted along the continental margins, which lowered the viscosity of the mantle, leading to meters per second runaway subduction. This means that the continental plates were moving faster than a race car. During this process, Baumgartner would also propose that the Earth's magnetic field rapidly reversed several times. The massive amount of heat caused huge amounts of water to evaporate into steam, which then caused a global rain. Flood basalts erupt all over the planet, and the lighter mantle material of the new ocean made them rise, allowing the oceans to flood the continents. This flood carried and redistributed sediments, effectively creating the geologic column of the past 500 million years. This process finally slowed down once nearly all the old ocean floor had been subducted, and today's rates are a consequence of that. Subsequent cooling of the ocean basins caused them to sink away into their current positions. The water recedes, Noah's Ark lands on Mount Ararat, and life begins anew. Heat problem-wise, this is going to run you about the equivalent of 48 hydrogen bombs per cubic kilometer. That is way too much heat to get rid of by any natural means, and for this reason, the overwhelming majority of creationists who believe in catastrophic plate tectonics appeal to a miraculous intervention on the part of God himself to get rid of all that heat. They appeal to a miracle. Here's the actual creator of catastrophic plate tectonics doing just that within the past year.
So one of the issues here with catastrophic plate tectonics is that you're dealing with the miraculous. And so I've not advertised that a lot. I've mentioned it in my papers, but I've not gone out of my way to advertise it. But here at this last meeting, I did highlight that we're talking about God intervening in a miraculous way, in a major miraculous way, during the flood.
For obvious reasons, this is the opinion that most major creationist organizations take, that we have a miraculous intervention, and this is also the position that Donnie has taken before.
Although we may not know the source or the mechanism behind the supercooling, perhaps it is supernatural.
The other flood model is called the hydroplate model, and it is just astronomically more ridiculous than catastrophic plate tectonics. I know you're thinking, how is that even possible? I know the audio is bad, but I think the writing is pretty good, so here's another clip from my previous video explaining the who, what, and how of hydroplate. Walt Brown is the perpetrator of the hydroplate hypothesis. Like creation scientists from CPT, Walt Brown does have a PhD. He's a retired military officer, and he runs the Center of Scientific Creation with his wife. His relationship with young Earth creationist organizations like Answers in Genesis and others is considered contentious at best. He evidently refuses to publish in their magazines, perhaps because some of the harshest critics of hydroplate are other young Earth creationists. And in fact, we'll be using some of their work here today. So, okay, what is hydroplate? Put simply, hydroplate proposes that the flood's waters come from an immense ocean of water existing 10 miles underground, which was released by a catastrophic rupture of Earth's crust, shot above the atmosphere, and then fell down as rain. However, it claims to be able to explain a whole lot more than that, so let's just go through it step by step. The pre-flood world is a very strange place in Walt Brown's model. Enormous bodies of water, which Walt thinks are the fountains of the great deep mentioned in the Bible, sit below the crust of the Earth instead of the mantle. This crust is a world-spanning granite slab that is about 10 to 60 miles thick, depending on the location one is measuring and the decade you're asking Walt Brown the question. Initially, Brown thought that this crust was smooth, but in 2003, Mormon pointed out that the Bible supposes there were mountains in the pre-flood world. So now Walt thinks that these mountains were formed by the sagging of the original smooth crust, which he refers to as the pillars of the earth. There is no support via experiment or observation that granite can act like what is essentially a putty without heat, pressure, and immense amounts of time, but for the sake of the argument, we will grant Walt Brown his impossible geology. To Brown, the start of the flood is initiated as this subcrustal water breaks free, bursting forth and creating vast cracks along the earth, not unlike the seam of a baseball. Why did it break free? Well, unlike catastrophic plate tectonics, Brown has a reason: tidal pumping from the moon. Pause. Doesn't this theologically mean that Adam and Eve were created and placed on what is essentially a ticking time bomb? Because in Walt's view, God made the moon and the tides and Adam and Eve, and tidal pumping is what caused the flood. So what would have happened if Adam and Eve just never ate from the apple? Would the flood have happened anyways? I don't know if Walt has actually answered this question. Due to the nature of this subcrustal water being superheated and hyperpressurized by the granite crust sitting on top of it, any earthquake, no matter how minor, in the pre-flood world would have initiated the flood. So Brown and his supporters proposed that plate tectonics simply didn't happen before the flood at all. This is problematic because Precambrian rock, which essentially all young Earth creationists think is created rock from before the flood, is wrought with fault lines. These Precambrian faults are additionally not found in Walt Brown's predicted locations and are chock full of microfossils. Why would created rock be full of dead things if death didn't happen before Eve ate the apple? Come to think of it, this one is problematic for CPT too, and I've never heard a creationist answer to this question. But let's suppose that the fault lines are in the right places and the microfossils don't exist.
Go on home, Walter. Let me handle this.
Let's pretend for Walter. What happens next? Brown's model has the water spewing forth along these mega fault lines and ejecting insane amounts of Earth rock. Some of these rocks escape Earth's orbit and end up creating the outer comets, asteroids, and every single crater in the solar system from Pluto to Mercury. Wait, it's worse than you think. Now, the asteroid belt alone has a mass that is about 3% of the moon, but that's just from those still in orbit. What about all of the asteroids that cratered planets like Mercury, Venus, Mars, and Pluto? What about the craters of the rocky moons orbiting the gas giants? Here's 5,223 named craters in the solar system, as well as countless unnamed craters. Many of these craters have diameters greater than our Chicxulub crater, which was the second biggest impact event on Earth. So putting all of that together, Glenn Kubin estimates that if all those craters came from Earth ejecta, the planet would have to be several times larger in the past. Physicist Gerard Jellison's calculations have the masses being over 100 times greater than the mass of the Earth today. Impossible, of course. Other young Earth creationists have noted that prior to this whole issue, the amount of energy required to get all of this material off the planet in the first place is insane. Danny Faulkner did some math and showed that if we used 1/1,000,000th of Brown's proposed energy, we end up heating the atmosphere by 34 degrees Celsius. All of it would heat it to 34 million degrees Celsius. But believe it or not, Walt has done his own math for the expulsion of all this material. He thinks that to account for all of the material that was ejected from Earth during hydroplate, we need 2.2 times 10 raised 31 joules. In other words, this is equivalent to that 5,000 trillion 1 megaton H-bomb number from earlier. Each cubic kilometer gets its own 5,000 hydrogen bombs. And I don't think I've ever pointed this out before, but that's 5,000 trillion hydrogen bombs just to get all the ejecta off the Earth. That's not even counting all the hydrogen bomb energy that's coming from accelerated nuclear decay or all of those other sources. So I hope it's pretty clear to see why most creationists think that hydroplate is really, 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 really dumb, and why most of the best debunks of hydroplate come from other young Earth creationists. So anyways, here's Donnie having several guests on to talk about how hydroplate actually is the better flood model. And not only that, but to talk about how hydroplate doesn't have a heat problem.
So most proponents of catastrophic plate tectonics that I've spoken to over the years doing seminars and live programs, most of them have appealed to a miracle. They've argued that God would have supernaturally intervened and removed the heat and radiation. Does the hydroplate model require supernatural intervention or a miracle to remove the heat and radiation, or no?
No.
What? Oh, okay. I didn't know that. Wow, how interesting, Brian Nickel. Now, those of you who have been following this channel for a while probably remember Brian Niccol. I've talked about his proposed mitigations for heat and for the problems surrounding the hydroplate model before on this channel. Brian Niccol has worked with Walt Brown directly. They've worked on the hydroplate hypothesis and tried to kind of craft it into something that makes a little bit more sense. So he's intimately familiar with all of the problems with hydroplate. But the most irritating part about Brian saying that is that's not what he thinks.
Does the hydroplate model require supernatural intervention or a miracle to remove the heat and radiation, or no?
No.
Yeah, hey Brian, this you?
So I won't say that we can just easily easily solve the heat problem for hydroplate theory, if you want to call it a heat problem, in terms of having some summation of numbers that just gives us an absolute, oh, this is solved, right?
That sucks.
Woof, that sucks. Talk about getting caught with your pants down. Now, I know what some of you might be thinking. Maybe Brian has, since that previous interview a year or so ago, discovered something new that actually does solve the heat problem. No, that is not what happened. I watched this entire video, I rewatched my old video, and I rewatched that first interview with Brian Niccol, and he just proposes the same mitigations as he did before. So why is he suddenly saying that the heat problem doesn't require a miracle? Well, effectively, because they're working on it. He's proposing the same sort of jumble of potential mitigations that he did previously, and he's thinking that if you sort of combine all of them together, there may be a solution in there. But the main reason he doesn't want to propose a miracle is because Brian knows that miracles make the model unscientific.
A hydroplate is never going to turn to a miracle in order to support the theory. And there's a reason for that. It's just, once you start adding miracles inside of your theory, and you just abandon cause to effect reasoning and trying to base it on the science that you know, it's not a question of whether or not God could do a miracle. As Christians, we believe he has the ability to do them. But when he hasn't recorded it in his word, we need to be very careful about just proclaiming miracles that happen to also align with where our theory is weak. So hydroplate theory is never going to appeal to a miracle inside the theory and say, heat left because God made it leave. That's the slippery slope, and that is just, you're lost in a sea of relativity at that point. And there's no way for a layman or a scientist to be able to decipher which set of proposed miracles is the right one for the theory.
So that's cool and all, and I'll even go so far as to say I co-sign everything he just said. Yeah, you can't appeal to a miracle and have it be anywhere close to scientific. But the reason why CPT proponents do appeal to a miracle is because they don't have a choice. And hydroplate is significantly worse than that. Hydroplate is so bad that when you ask other creationists about it, they're like, nah, nope, that shit is silly.
Well, the next question in line is what do I think about the hydroplate theory?
Yes.
Not much, sorry. I've examined it. In fact, I have a 10,000 or more word article on the CMI website, 2013, where I examined a lot of that stuff. I think he believes that most or all the asteroids and comets are from the fountains of the great deep, shooting material up into the space. Now, Faulkner especially has developed that. I think in 2013 also, he's gone into that, Faulkner being an astronomer, delving into that and show that couldn't possibly be the case. But anyway, you have problems having escaped the gravity of the Earth, major problems. He brings up some suggested mechanisms, which I've talked to people about some of these, like a water hammer, that make no sense and couldn't do it. So anyway, make a long story short, I have
serious problems with his idea.
It's not fair. It's not fair that, like, this is even something that I think anyone has to go through.
Now, like I said, Brian Niccol does go through some of these ideas that he's proposed before of means by which to get rid of the heat, and a lot of it boils down to they're turning the flood into an open system so the heat can escape by various mechanisms to space, or like the water can cool down when the fountains of the deep jettison up all the water and then it comes back down. None of this works, and I went in great detail as to why none of Niccol's mechanisms actually work to get rid of this heat or to mitigate it really at all in my hydroplate video, but Donnie doesn't really go through my issues with Niccol's solutions to the heat problem. Like, I could sit here and go line by line with Brian Niccol, but I kid you not, it's just gonna be me taking clips from that other video or rephrasing those clips and pitching them to you here, because Niccol is doing the Donnie Deals fallacy. He's not saying Erica's criticisms don't work because of B, he's just reasserting A. They do this with a ton of stuff in this interview, in this video, with these guests, with Brian, with Raw Matt. It's stuff that we've already done before. So, for example, for water to be able to reach escape velocity, the fountains of the Great Deep need to be jettisoning it up at like Mach 150 plus. That's math from a young Earth creationist, Danny Faulkner. They invoke the piezoelectric effect or the Proton 21 lab to try to explain how you can mitigate the heat from accelerated nuclear decay, and it's like the piezoelectric effect of that scale would require conditions that cannot exist on Earth, and another young Earth creationist did the math for that. For the Proton 21 lab, those guys were simulating nucleosynthesis, meaning in order to utilize the work of the Proton 21 lab, Earth would need to be in the condition of a star. So we're not really talking about a heat problem anymore if the Earth is literally a star. It's too late. So what I'll say is that if Donnie wants me to address line by line what they're saying in this interview, he needs to feed them my actual objections to see what they say. Until then, I'm just going to gesture broadly at the last time I took them sentence by sentence and explained why their work doesn't actually solve or even mitigate the heat problem. And like, this isn't my work, this is me reporting other people's work, many of whom are young Earth creationists, and this is why no one accepts hydroplate. But Donnie and the hydroplate guys here are having a hard time with the current state of young Earth creationism and how desperate it is, where it must appeal to a miracle to make its idea work, thus making it no longer scientific. Brian Niccol is right about that. The problem is his worldview isn't scientific. This is a common theistic evolutionist W, where normal religious people are able to look at the world and use science to investigate it and say, well, science is science. The data say what the data say. God must have used evolution, and the Earth is truly very ancient. The way we're interpreting scripture through a modern lens is incorrect, and they simply believe in a God that is more powerful than the ones that young Earth creationists must appeal to. And the most recent polls that show us the vast majority of people, and even of Christians here in the United States, accept evolution as the means by which not just regular life, but also humans came about, they can sniff the desperation. They are rejecting young Earth creationism at a rate that we have never seen in the United States. And that's kind of strange given the general climate towards science that we're living in right now. In an age where basically every brand of pseudoscience is experiencing a very large renaissance, you would expect that creationism would be the same. But no, their numbers continue to drop. I have an idea as to why I think this may be and whether I think it's going to last or not, but it's going to take me 3 very large videos to flesh out. Maybe more, we'll see. So for now, I'll end it with this. Current creationism is kind of pathetic. There are a few exceptions, but by and large, I'm seeing some of the worst arguments, some of the most blatant lies, and some of the most cringe methods of delivery that I think I've seen from creationism, and I'm pretty well versed in that as a subject, unfortunately. Will their arguments get better? Will they stop lying? Will they stop using AI? I think the answer to all 3 of those is probably no, but I'm willing to be pleasantly surprised. Put your favorite example of embarrassing creationist nonsense in the comment section. I would actually genuinely love to hear what you're encountering online or out in the wild. And if you like this kind of content, please consider supporting me in the free way by liking, commenting, and subscribing. It helps the channel by suggesting videos to other people who might find them interesting, and that boosts the numbers. Line go up. If you want to support me in a more financial way, you can join my Patreon. Patrons get early access to videos when I'm on top of things, which, as I always say, it's 50-50. With all that being said, I would like to thank you from the bottom of my gentle and, of course, very modern heart for being such a curious primate, and I'll see you real soon next time.